This is the best video to get started with JavaScript because you'll learn by actually building a modern project. While other courses teach you outdated JavaScript, here you'll learn modern concepts and modern best practices. I'm Wesley and I've been a full stack developer for years myself, and I know exactly what you need to know about JavaScript, and that's what you're going to learn here. So about JavaScript, we can use it to build websites and web apps, for example, with just plain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or more commonly use a framework like React, Angular, or Vue. We can build mobile apps with, for example, React Native, desktop apps with Electron, server apps with Node.js, and even games and AI and virtual reality apps can be built with JavaScript these days. So there's a saying, anything that can be built with JavaScript will eventually be built with JavaScript. JavaScript is different from Java. They were created around the same time, but they're completely different. And the technical standard is actually called ECMAScript, or ES for short, and it has new versions every year. A big update was in ES6. In this video, you'll learn the modern JavaScript concepts that developers use in practice. In other tutorials, they teach you outdated concepts. There are no prerequisites to get started with this video. Alright, so we're gonna create websites or web apps, and so we're gonna be working with a browser. So I'm gonna use Chrome, and if you look at the statistics, most people in the world use Chrome. So I looked up these statistics, and this is for both desktop as well as mobile. So total worldwide, this is the browser market share. So if you're interested in that, this is how it looks like, right? So you can see most people use Chrome. Now Safari is quite popular because remember iPhone is very popular, and this is the default browser on iPhone. And Microsoft actually has a new browser, a new-ish browser called Edge, right? So they don't have Internet Explorer anymore. They're not developing that anymore. They now have Edge, and actually Edge is growing pretty rapidly. Firefox is still hanging in there, and then there are some other smaller browsers around the world as well. The most popular one is Chrome. So I recommend that we all use Chrome for developing because most of your users are going to be using that. All right, so we're going to write code, and we need a program to write the code in. Technically, we could use something like Notepad on Windows, for example, right? So these built-in text editors. Technically, that's possible, but ideally you use a dedicated program for code editing because it comes with a lot of handy built-in functionalities. For example, they actually show it in the screenshot here. If you type something, it can suggest options. It can highlight the line that you're on. It will show the line numbers, right? It wraps certain lines if there's not enough space. It comes with all sorts of extensions, right? So there's so many, handy features in a dedicated code editor that it's better to use a code editor. Now, the most popular one is called Visual Studio Code, right? So you can just Google that and VS Code, and it's the first one here. So to install Visual Studio Code, you can go to the website and just click on the button here or whatever operating system you use, and it should pop up in a moment. It can take a couple of seconds because it's a pretty big file. All right, so then you can just click there and open it up, and you can just go through the steps. Nothing special here. Of course, you should read the agreement. Nothing special here. Don't change anything. Maybe just add it to the desktop as an icon, maybe if that's what you want. And then just click next, and then you can click on install and it will install it for you. All right, so I opened up my code editor here. Let's say I want to create a new project, and maybe you want to follow along, or maybe you just want to watch. Both is fine. You may see a welcome screen, by the way. You can click it away. Right, so the first step of creating a new project is to click on Explorer and open a folder. You can also click on File, Open Folder, and you need to pick a folder where you're going to put all the files of your project. So I'm going to go to Desktop here. You can put it anywhere you want. So I'm going to go on Desktop here, and I'm going to create a new folder here called JavaScript tutorial. I'm going to pick that folder and I'm going to select that one. And it will open up that folder here in our code editor. Now I get this welcome screen here. I can click it away. And the second step is really to start creating some files. Right, so you can click on this icon here, the plus sign, and you can create a file. Now the first file that we're going to create here is an HTML file. Right, so I know it's a JavaScript video, but the story actually starts with web development, starts with HTML. And I'm going to call this file index.html. Why index? You can call it anything you want as long as the extension is .html. The reason for index is it's a remnant from the past, and people have kind of stuck with this. So this is just a common name that you're going to see. And it's also good to know that if you go to a website, for example, if I go to airbnb.com, which may be a very complicated website, it may even be built with a framework like Angular or React or Vue. But if I go to a React app, for example, if I go to a website that was built with React, now let's say airbnb.com, I press enter here. The first thing that's going to happen is my browser is going to send a network request to the Airbnb server. And the first file that we're going to get back is not a JavaScript file, right? So even though you may be coding in JavaScript almost 100% of the time, if you're creating a React app, for example, the first file that we would get back is still an HTML file, right? So the story of web development still starts with HTML. Here in HTML, we can write HTML. We want the second option, and Emmet, if we press tab, Emmet will give us this HTML boilerplate. I'm also going to close the sidebar here by clicking and dragging it to the left. So we need to know a little bit about HTML and also CSS, because often what we want to do with JavaScript is actually interact with HTML and CSS. We want to manipulate the HTML very often. I'm going to add some space here. I'm going to change the title to JavaScript tutorial. And I'm also going to add something here to the body. I can write p.text and then press tab. It will give me the entire paragraph element with text as a class, and I will type here just a test. Okay, so I'm gonna save the file by Control S. You can see the file has changed because it has this yellow dot here. So if I save here, that yellow dot goes away. And now let's try opening this up in the browser. So what you can do is you can click and drag this file onto the top part of your browser, and it should open this up here. I'm going to increase the zoom here a little bit just so you can see what I'm doing here. You don't have to do that in case you're following along. And I'm gonna make this a little bit wider here, our code editor. All right, so this is very much the basics, right? So HTML is really for the raw information on the page. So it consists of this HTML declaration, and it's basically a tree of elements, right? So then we have the root element, HTML, and in there we have head and body. The head is for meta information. We could say information about the actual information. Then the body is the actual information that you want to convey to the user, right? So in the head, we have these weird meta tags. It's not really important to understand this. This is for the character set. This is for Internet Explorer. And this one has to do with making it responsive. So don't change anything here. The title here is actually what we see in the tab as well, right? So search engines like Google may also use this. All right, now in the body, we will have all sorts of elements that we want to use to display certain information to the user, right? So here I'm just using a paragraph element, but we also have header, we have main for the dominant content on the page, we have pan, we have div, very common, right? So there are all sorts of HTML tags, as they're called. It's not really important to know the very details of HTML right now, so that's not what we're going to spend time on. Now, what is important is, now let's say we want to make this look a little bit better, because HTML is for the raw information, and now let's say we want to make it look better. We want to style this paragraph here, let's say. So now we're gonna need to use CSS, right? So let's open up the sidebar here again by clicking on this icon, and let's create a new folder here now for the CSS. We're gonna call that file style.css, also a common name. You can call it whatever you want, styles.css or style sheet. I'm gonna close the sidebar, and here's where we can write CSS, right? So what we want is we want to style this paragraph, so we have to select it first. So you can use the class, right? It's called text, and you have to write dot text, right? So if you're selecting by class, you use a dot, and then let's say we want to make the color red, right? So you have color as a property and then the value for that property, and the entire thing is called a declaration, and this entire thing is called a rule set. Right, so if I save here and now I refresh, the text does not become red. And this is very important, because the reason it doesn't become red is because the browser receives this HTML file, right? So if I refresh here, we're just reloading this HTML file. So the browser will go through the HTML file line by line, and never here does it see anything that links to the CSS file, right? So it doesn't know that this CSS file exists, even though here on our computer it's in the same folder. In the HTML file, we're not linking to that, right? So typically, when you don't see any CSS being applied, it's because you forgot to link to that. So here what we can do is we can write link, press tab, and the default here is a style sheet. So we want to link to a style sheet, and it asks us where it can find the style sheet. Since it's in the same folder, we only have to write style.css. And if we save here, I'm going to Control S, save the file, and now refresh, you can see the text actually becomes red. And let me actually make this a little even bigger for you. Right, so this is really important to understand. If you want to use an external resource, right, so HTML is really where it starts, and then if you want to use an external resource like CSS or JavaScript or a font, you have to link to that here. So let's say we also want to use a different font. So a very popular website to find fonts is fonts.google.com. So Google hosts all sorts of very nice fonts. So the one that we're going to use for this little project in this video is going to be called Inter. This is a very popular font also among designers. It's my go-to font. I think it looks very professional. Now the way this works is you click on Inter, and then now you have to pick the weights of the font, because you don't get all the weights by default, because often you don't want to use all the weights, so you're just unnecessarily adding bytes to your HTML. So here, let's say we want to have all the fonts all from 300 to 700. And then they give you this sidebar here. If you don't see the sidebar, you have to click on this icon here. And they, let's see, it's always a bit confusing, this website, I think. But here they show you what you need to include in your HTML, right? So this link here, so we can just copy that. And then I can go back here and I will paste this in front of my linking to our own style sheet here. I'm going to paste it right here. And you get actually 3 links. The first 2 are just for optimizations. The third link is what will actually link to the actual font. Right, so this is another example of an external resource. If you want to use, it's an external resource, so we have to link to that here in our HTML. Right, so now if we refresh, it will not use that font immediately. So we have to set that here in the HTML. Right, so here or in the CSS. Right, so here we have to say the font family should be inter, and typically we also want to have a backup font, because the Google font server may be down, and then we can say comma, if it's not available for whatever reason, pick any sans serif font available on the user's computer. So now if I refresh, you can see the font has changed. Okay, so this was a very quick crash course on HTML and CSS. I have separate videos on this. This is about what you need to know right now. Now, in this video, we're going to build a little project. So I want to add the actual information and the actual CSS for that project now. So I'm going to remove this boilerplate stuff. I will keep the boilerplate, but we're going to remove this test stuff. And now I'm going to copy and paste the HTML for the project. And if you want to code along, you can do that. You can find the link to that HTML in the description. So you can copy that from the description and you can also paste it in here. So this is going to be a bunch of HTML. You can go through it if you want. It's not really important for now. It's a JavaScript video, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. But now if I refresh, you can see we now have the actual information, the actual raw information for this project. And it doesn't look great, right? So this is not easy to consume. This is not pleasant to interact with either. So typically you want to style things. Now, I highly recommend, if you want to do anything with the front end, that you go through my professional CSS course. CSS is really important, especially Flexbox and CSS Grid and animations and transitions. Yeah, it's just really important. You're going to lose a lot of time and energy, and you're going to have a lot of frustrations if you don't know how it really works. So check out my course on that. You can find the link in the description. Now, I've copied the CSS code for this project. I'm going to paste it here as well. Right? Again, if you're coding along, you don't have to code along. Maybe you just want to watch. But if you're coding along, you can find the CSS code for this project in the description as well. So now I've saved this, I'm going to refresh, and now you can see, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. You don't have to do that. I'm just zooming here for the video. Now you can see we have our project here. Now one problem right now is it doesn't work, right? So we do have some animations and transitions here, but if I click on this item here, it doesn't get removed, right? If I add some description here like groceries, and I spent, let's say, 300 on groceries, so negative 300. If I click on add button right now, we actually get some default behavior from the browser, which is that it's a form, so it will try to submit the form. And the default behavior is actually that it sort of refreshes the page, but you don't see anything here, right? So it's not reflected that we added that here. Right, we'll talk more about this weird form behavior, but the point being is it doesn't work right now. Right, so we need to use some actual JavaScript code to make this work. And before we start doing that, you need to know JavaScript. So let's talk about JavaScript now. So JavaScript, just like CSS, just like this font, is an external resource. So we need to link to that. So let's start doing that here. Let's actually create the file first. So let's create a file where we're going to write our JavaScript, script.js, common name, can call it whatever you want, main.js, app.js. Right, script.js is also a common name. I'm going to cross the sidebar here, and again, I can also do that by holding Control B. All right, so now we want to link to this script file, right? Because again, if you forget to do that, you can write all the JavaScript in the world. If you're not linking to that here in the HTML, the browser will not know if it's existent. It will not apply the JavaScript to the page. Now with JavaScript, it's a little bit strange. We don't write link. We actually use script. So you can write script, press tab, and then we use source. So here it wants to know the path to this script file. Well, it's in the same folder, so we can just write script.js. All right, now there's one problem with this, which is, remember when we go to, when the browser loads the HTML and it goes through, because it's going to go line by line, right? And all of this is fine, right? So here we're linking to the font and our style sheet. It will load these in parallel, right? So it's not really blocking, and nothing is really blocking here. Now, as it gets to the script file though, it will actually block parsing the rest of the HTML. This is the downside of doing it like this. Now, in the past, people have solved this. There's certain technical reasons for that, by the way. In the past, people have solved that by putting this script file at the end of the body here. The downside of this is, of course, that the browser has to parse all of this HTML first before it knows even the existence of this script file and can start downloading that. So this is suboptimal. So these days in modern JavaScript, the best practice right now is to keep it in the head here, but you want to add the defer attribute. So here we can add defer is defer. Now since you can, if you run it like this in HTML, you can also just leave it off like this, right? And this tells the browser, don't block parsing the rest of the page, but download this script. And then once the HTML has been completely parsed, you can execute the script, right? So now this is not blocking anymore, right? So this is the modern solution, you could say, of including a JavaScript file. So now we can actually write some JavaScript and we can actually try making this app work. All right, now I think there are about 10 concepts in JavaScript that are really important to understand. And once you know them, I would consider you a JavaScript developer. So I'm going to copy those concepts and I'm going to paste them right here so we can go through them one by one. And what I've done here is I've pressed Alt-Z, which means my lines automatically wrap onto a new line because I don't want to make the project too narrow. Right, so you can see if I make the code editor a little bit more narrow, it actually wraps. Right, so it's going to look a little bit different depending on how long the line is that I'm writing, right? So that's just a side note. All right, now maybe the first thing that's obvious is you can write comments here with /, 2 forward slashes, right? So I can type something here and it will be different color than if you have 2 forward slashes. So a comment is basically just for developer, just to add some structure or an explanation for something. And it's not really run as code, right? So it's not really doing anything. It's just some non-functioning text, essentially. All right, so the first concept that is important is variables, right? So I can have, let's say, as we see in the project, we can have some kind of balance, right? And the balance is 5,000. Now, 5,000 here is just some loose code. We need to store that somewhere. And we use variables for that. So I can create a variable. I can say var with the var keyword, and then I can give it a name called balance. And then let's say it's 5,000. So we want to say assign the number 5,000. We'll talk about what a number is, but this is a number 5,000. We're assigning that, that's what the equal sign means, to a new variable called balance. And this is a statement. And after a statement, you write a semicolon, right? So if you have a number, or we'll see what a string is, basically text, a string, or a boolean, true or false, we'll talk about that. If you have something like that, usually you want to store it somewhere. You cannot just have random numbers, all over the place, right? So you need to store those things somewhere, and we use variables for that. And here we're using the var keyword. I'll get back to that in a second. You can also call it var b, for example, right? You can call it whatever you want, but typically you do want to name your variables in a way that makes sense, right? So it should sort of reflect what is in there, right? So we could also have something else. We could say var description, right? We're also going to have a description. This could be a string. We use quotation marks for that. And again, we'll talk about that, but we can have quotation marks for that. And we can say that's a salary. So here, a semicolon at the end, we're assigning a string, right? This is a string. We're assigning that to a new variable called description. And I could keep going here, right? So we could have another variable in our app. Maybe var, is there a new transaction, right? Maybe new transaction. This could be true or false. It's called a boolean, right? So now we've seen strings, numbers, and booleans. I'll get back to that. But now this is a boolean. This can be true or false. So it's either true or false, right? So it's basically text without the quotation marks, but it's always true or false. This is a boolean, and we're assigning that to a new variable called new transaction. So in JavaScript, by the way, if you have some kind of name for your variables or functions, we'll talk about what functions are, we use camel case for that. So the first character is lowercase, and then the second word, the first character is uppercase. In other programming languages, you may see this. This is called kebab case or snake case, right? So in JavaScript, we use camel case, right? And I could keep going here. Now, var is a bit old school. This is the, you could say, old-fashioned way of creating variables with the var keyword. These days, in modern JavaScript, we have let and const. Why are we using new ones? What's wrong with var? Well, one tricky thing with var is I could accidentally override these variables, right? So I could say later onwards, balance is 9,000, right? So some other programmer may actually use the same word and accidentally assign something new to that, unintended, and that's allowed with var, right? So var allows you to reassign a new value to it, right? So now going forward, the balance variable is actually 9,000. The problem with this is that you get bugs in your program, right? So if you allow for unintended things in your program, you know, in the real world, your programs are going to be quite big, could be multiple people working on it. So you're going to get bugs, as they're called, right? Really problems in your application, unintended effect. So typically we want to be strict with ourselves. And that's why these days we don't use var. You'll see a lot of const, right? So instead of var, we use const. And what developers do these days is they use const for everything. And sometimes you do need to actually override the variable value, right? So instead of balance being 5,000, maybe we need to actually make it 9,000. And if you do it with const like this, we will get an error, right? Our program will stop. There will be an error. It will not allow us to run this. And that's actually a good thing. We want to be strict with ourselves. That's why we're going to use const everywhere. Unless we actually, you know, sometimes you actually need to reassign a new value. So in that case, you may actually want to use the let keyword, right? So with let, if you create a variable with the let keyword, you are allowed to do this, right? But typically you want to use const everywhere unless you need to actually reassign a new value. In that case, you want to use let. So it's a bit confusing for a beginner. You know, it used to be easier in JavaScript, always use var. Now we have these three ones. You don't really see var that often anymore, so it's only two, I guess. And you want to use const always unless you actually need to reassign a new value to a variable. In that case, use a let. And all of these things are called statements, right? So whenever you see a semicolon, that's a statement. And a JavaScript program is essentially a sequence of statements. So here this is statement 1, right? And in this statement, we're assigning the number 5,000 to a new variable. I'm calling it a variable, by the way, even though I'm creating it with the constant keyword. It still belongs to the category variables, right? So people will still refer to all of them as variables, right? Even though this is a constant, you know, created with a const keyword, I'm still going to call this a variable because it's the category variables. But we're assigning the number 5,000 to this variable balance. Only when that is finished do we continue to the next statement here, right? So here we're assigning a string salary to description. Right. Only when that is finished do we continue to this line here. Right. So this is very, you know, it's very in line with your intuition, right? Line by line, sequential, also called synchronous in JavaScript. Now, what can we do with this? Let's actually try doing something crazy here in our app. How can we now sort of interact with this? Well, what we could do, for example, let's make this balance not 5,000, but let's make it 2,000. Let's try setting this balance here of 5,000. Let's try setting that to whatever we put in the balance variable here. And so if we look at the HTML, I'm gonna wrap all of these lines here as well, Alt Z for me. So it makes it a bit unreadable, but we can still see what's happening here. So here we have the top here, and we have this span here, balance number. This is 5,000. This is the HTML, and that's what we see here, right? The browser takes the HTML and also the CSS and then turns it into what we see here, and we see the 5,000 back here. Right. Now let's say we want to sort of manipulate this with our JavaScript, right? Very common use case of JavaScript. We want to manipulate the HTML. Another word for this is DOM manipulation. So what you need to do is here we want to change basically the content of this span element, right? So HTML has elements. This is an HTML element. We want to change its text content, and it has this class balance number. So the first thing you need to do, and don't worry, we'll talk more about this interacting with HTML and CSS in a second, and also, of course, when we start actually building the project completely. I just quickly want to give you a demonstration here. Don't worry, it's going to look a little bit strange, but we need to first get a reference to this HTML element, and then we can change its number in here, or its text content, as it's called. So we can get a reference. That's just like with CSS. First, you need to select elements with a selector, right? We have seen it with a class, dot header, dot wrapper. Here with JavaScript, we need to select it first as well. And we can use the class even. We can even use the CSS selectors. Typically in JavaScript, to select an element, it's going to look like this. Don't worry, it's going to look a bit strange. We use query selector these days to select something from the document, right? So the HTML, you can also see it as a document. And if you're running JavaScript in the browser here, the browser will give you something called the document. And on the document, you can call query selector, which is a very strange word, but in here we can use a CSS selector to select something from the document. So we can use balance number here. We can say dot balance dash number, right? And again, it's wrapping onto a new line here because of word wrap, right? It's just my code editor, right? So if I would make this full screen, it would just be one line on line 6, right? So that's why it may look a bit strange or different for you depending on how wide your code editor is, right? I'm using a semicolon here at the end, right? So this will give us a reference to this HTML element. Now, just like with these numbers, we want to store that in somewhere. So we want to create a variable for that, and you want to give your variable names something descriptive, right? So this is going to be balance number, and I like to append L. So this will give us a reference to this HTML element, and we're assigning that, right? We're assigning that to this variable here, right? Created with the const keyword. And now we can use that. We can say balance number L text content. We can give that, we can make that anything we want, right? We can make that 10,000, right? So I'm assigning the number 10,000. I'm assigning that to balance number element dot text content balance number L dot text content. So now if I save here and refresh, we indeed see that we manipulated the HTML from our JavaScript. And so in the HTML, this is still 5,000. But what do we see on the page now? It's 10,000 because we have manipulated that with the JavaScript. Let me actually make this a little bit wider, right? So first we give the HTML to the browser, right? So when I reload here, it will first be 5,000 because the browser is first going to parse all the HTML. So it's first going to be 5,000, and only once it has parsed all the HTML will it start running this script here, right? So it actually is going to change the 5,000 to, you can actually see it for a brief moment if you look closely. It will first be 5,000, and then we are manipulating that here with our JavaScript. Right now here we're hard coding 10,000, right? So it's always going to be 10,000 now. Maybe we actually want that to be whatever is coming from a variable, right? So here we put it in a separate variable called balance. We can use that variable name here, right? So we can say balance. So now it should become 2,000, right? So if I refresh here, we indeed see it will be 2,000 here, right? If I change the value of that variable to 8,000 and save here and refresh, it becomes 8,000, right? So very simple examples of variables here and how we can manipulate the HTML here. This looks a bit strange here with query selector and text content. Don't worry about that. We'll practice more with that. I'm going to save here. I'm going to remove everything. I'm going to save here, refresh. Now we have the default here 5,000, which is just coming from the HTML. All right, so there's one other thing I want to show you here. On any website, you can right click and you can click on inspect. And what you will get is this. This is called the browser developer tools. So you have a couple of tabs here. The first one is elements. So here we actually see the HTML, and then below there you actually see the CSS being applied to that HTML, right? That's HTML and CSS. Now for the JavaScript, we are often interested in working with the console, right? So here I can actually write JavaScript. So I could say something like salary 3,000. Right, I could assign the number 3,000 to a new variable called salary. I can press enter here. Whenever you write a line that doesn't return something as it's called, you're going to get something like undefined. So here we're just creating a new variable, assigning a value to it. We're not really returning, and we'll talk about what returning means. Here we're not returning anything, so you see this undefined. It's just how browsers work. It's a bit confusing. But now if I type salary here, the salary, we will actually get the value for salary, right? So you can write JavaScript in here. Sometimes you want to do that maybe to quickly test some new concept that you learned about. Maybe you want to manipulate something on the page on the website that you're on. You want to write you want to write JavaScript. Now, quite often we also want to use it to output something from our script here. So here what I can use is we can say console. I'll put a semicolon there, and here I can log something to the console. Let's actually try logging the number 1,000. Right, so I'm going to save here, and now I'm going to open up the developer tools here again. Now you can see it's a bit problematic in terms of space. So for these videos, I like to dock it at the bottom, right? You can leave it on the right side. That's what most developers have. But you can also dock it to the bottom here. And now it's to the bottom here. I'm going to scroll a little bit here. And you can see if I now refresh, you can see that it's logging, as it's called. It's writing the number 1,000 here in the console. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Right, so sometimes we want to use this to check if some variable is indeed the value that we think it is. Right, so I could log balance here. If I save here and refresh, we see 8,000. I can log new transaction. If I save here and refresh, we see true, right? I can log description and we see salary, right? So we will use this console a lot to check if something is true or something is indeed what we expect it to be. All right, so let's continue with data types and data structures in JavaScript. We've already seen some of them. So we've seen number, we've seen string, and we've seen Boolean. But we also have arrays and objects, right? So I'm gonna remove this. I could also comment it out, by the way. So I could select all of this and I could hold Control// to make this a comment. I'm going to remove all of it so we can start from a clean slate here. So we have strings, numbers, booleans, arrays, and objects, right? So strings, let's use variables here as well. So we could have some text, right? That's a string. With quotation marks, you can also use double quotation marks, by the way. Both works. For me, it's a bit easier to write single quotation marks. So this is what I use. We have numbers, right? Salary, for example, could be 2,000, right? If you try adding the dollar sign in front of it, now it's not a number anymore. So it should be like actual literal numbers only. If you want to do it with a dollar sign, maybe make it a string. Right, so now it becomes $2,000, but it's a string. Okay, and then we also have booleans. Is expense? Is it an expense? Maybe it's false. Maybe it's not an expense. Okay, that's strings, numbers, booleans, and then we have arrays. So often in your programs or applications, you want to have a list of something. Right, so we could have, let's say, const expenses. Right, so we could have a list of expenses, and in a list in JavaScript is an array, and you use square brackets with that, right? So a list of something, you want to use an array, and then in here we have the actual values that are part of a list, right? So we could have an expense of, let's say, 1,000, right? Another expense of 25, right? So now we have a list of expenses, and these are called elements of that list, right? So 1,000 is an element, 30 is an element, 25 is an element. That's basically it, right? So it's a list. So now let's say, let me actually refresh here to get rid of the salary here. So now we don't have anything in the console, we're not logging anything. But now let's say we want to see, we want to work a little bit with this array. So I'm going to log something here. Let's log the entire expenses array. If I refresh, we see the entire array, right? So you can even open that up and it will show you the elements in there. Now, it also gives you this length. So sometimes you want to know, for example, expenses.length. You want to see how many elements are in the array. So you can say expenses.length. If I refresh here, it will give us the number of elements in there. Very common thing to do, right? So if you open it up, it will give you the elements in there. It will give you the length. Now, sometimes you're also going to see something with this weird prototype. This has to do with how JavaScript works under the hood. It's part of my JavaScript course as well, but it's not really important. It's more of an advanced topic, and it's not really something that you should be thinking about as a beginner, right? So you can just ignore this. It's not really important. Actually, you don't even work with this in practice. So even if you never learn about it, it doesn't really impact you as a developer, right? Now, let's say I want to know the element in the array that is, let's say, the second one. Right, so I want to try logging 30 from here essentially. So how do we do that? Well, you use expenses, and now you can use square brackets access the individual elements. Now you have to understand that in arrays, these are, it starts from index 0, right? So here you have to provide the index of the element that you want to see. So if you want to get the first one, it's not number 1, it's actually 0, right? So this has index 0, this has index 1, and this has index 2. So if I log here and I refresh, we actually get the number 1,000 because that's the first one. If we do this, expenses 1, we get the number 30, right? It's always a little bit confusing. So if you want to get the second element in the array, you shouldn't write 2. Because if you write 2 here, we actually get 25, which is actually the third one. The indexes here start from 0. So it's 0, 1, 2. So it's an array, right? It's just a list of elements, and the tricky part is they start with 0. The indexes start with 0. Okay, so then we also have object. So let's see. An object represents something. So let's say we have a transaction, right? And now with objects, we have curly braces. And typically you press enter here to open it up, and I'll write a semicolon at the end. So an object is used to represent something. It consists of properties. So a transaction, for example, could have, for example, a description, right? So a description property, and then you have some value. So this is the key, and then you have a value for that key. So this could be, for example, salary. string salary. And then we could have comma. Another property of this transaction object could be amount, right? And that could be a number, right? So here we are associating these two properties together, right? They're both part of the same object that represents the transaction here, right? Because here, all of these things so far that we've done, all of this is just some loose code, right? For example, if we make this const description and salary, right? And maybe we'll make this amount and 5,000, right? These are just loose statements. They are not connected in any way, right? None of this is connected, right? They're just some loose statements, just sort of isolated individual statements. All of these variables are just being individuals, right? It's not really connected in any way. Now, sometimes, often, actually very often in programming, in your programs, you want to associate them together, right? So you want to be explicit about the fact that they're being that they're associated with each other. So you would use an object for that to sort of create an entity. And one of the advantages is that now when you use transaction, this is now a sort of an entity in your program, right? And you can look in there to see the individual properties of this object. So what we could do here, for example, is we could log transaction, and we want to see the description of this transaction. So you can use dot notation, and you can say dot description. Right, console log transaction dot description. So if I save here and refresh, we get salary. Right, so if I want to see the amount of this transaction, I can say transaction dot amount, and it will give me 5,000. Right, but I know that the amount and the description, they are connected to each other. Also, when I have to pass this information to a server, let's say I'm going to submit it to a server so that the server can save it in a database, let's say, don't worry about that, but I may have to pass this information to something else. I only have to write transaction, right? Because then in the transaction object, there will be the individual properties. So I only have to write transaction instead of all of those individual variables individually, right? So then I would have to pass description and then amount, right? And then even more properties. There could be hundreds of properties in a big object, right? So now I only have to write transaction, right? And then the other side, if they want to see what's in there, they can use transaction and just see what the value is for these individual properties, right? And with these objects, it becomes easier to reason about your code as well, because if you just have some loose code like this, there's no structure. But with these objects, you create entities in your code. So it becomes easier to reason about your program because you have these entities to hold in your head, right? Another common example, for example, maybe we have an error object, right? And then in the error, we could have something like a description of the error. Maybe not found. And maybe there's some kind of status code, maybe 404. Should we retry, right? So whatever we did, should we retry this? Maybe false, right? Maybe we should fix something first. And so now all of these properties, they are together representing, right? So you'll see objects a lot. They may be a bit tricky, they may look a bit scary, but it's just a way of associating some properties together, some information together to represent some kind of entity. And it comes with certain benefits, right? So we'll practice with this a lot. All right, let's move on to functions. I'm going to comment this out so I can select everything here, hold Control / save the file, refresh. Now we start from a clean slate here. I'm making these comments because we may want to reference this. Right, so now I'm not removing them. So here we have functions. With functions, we are essentially grouping together statements. Right, so if we look at this, let me uncomment this for a second. These are all statements that come one after another, immediately as the script is run. Right, so as soon as the browser has downloaded this script and here it has parsed the HTML, it's going to execute this script. It's going to go line by line here, and it's basically just a sequence of statements. Any program, any application, it's just a sequence of statements. And so it's gonna create this string salary, it's gonna assign it to a new variable called description. Once that is finished, will it continue to this line here, right? And only when it has finished this will it continue here. Right? So not before it has finished that. Right? No matter how long this takes, by the way. If this takes a long time for whatever reason, it will sort of stay there, right? It will not just start randomly continuing here, right? So it's line by line here, statement by statement. All of this will be immediately run as soon as the script is executed here. But sometimes we don't want to immediately run statements, right? So these are all statements. Every time you see a semicolon here, that's a statement. This is one statement, this is one statement, this is one statement. Sometimes we don't immediately want to run statements as soon as the script is executed. We want to save it for later, you could say. So here you want to use a function. So here we can you create a function with the function keyword and you can give it a name. For example, in our application, you can imagine we could have something like calculate balance, and you use opening and closing parentheses, and then you have curly braces. There's no semicolon here. In my JavaScript course, I'll have a separate video on where to use semicolons, how to do formatting in JavaScript. It's not really important for now. So we have a function here called calculate balance. And in here, in the function body, as it's called, so those are here at the curly braces, here we will have statements, right? So we've seen statements before, right? So here we can have statements, and these will not immediately be run as this script is run because they're in the function body. They will only run when we actually execute this function or call the function. We'll see how that works. So here we could have something like we could have statements, right? So we could have a new variable, let's say income. We can assign some number to that, 5,000, let's say, and then we can have another statement here. Expenses would be 2,000, let's say, right? And then maybe we have balance is income minus expenses, right? These are 3 statements here, right? And maybe at the end we want to log the balance. Right, let's just see what we get. So now we have 4 statements, right? So the logging here is also a statement. If I save here, if I refresh here and save and refresh, we don't see anything log to the console, even though we say console log balance here. We don't see that here. We don't see anything because these statements are not immediately run, right? The browser will go top to bottom here and it will go line by line. And here it will see, oh, we need to create a function, right? With these statements as part of its function body. Right, so this is just a function specification. It knows not to run this function immediately. It just knows, okay, so these statements need to be run when this function is called. So now let's try calling the function. So we can say calculate balance, you use the name, and then you use opening and closing parentheses and a semicolon after that. So now we're actually calling the function, meaning we want to run the statements in the function body. Looks a bit strange here. Why do we make it so complicated? Well, we'll see why, but this is the mechanics of it, right? So you create a function, right? Basically just a specification of some function, and then later in your program, you want to run the statements in there. So you call the function, or also called executing the function. So now if I save and refresh, we do actually see something being logged to the console here, 3,000, because income is 5,000, expenses is 2,000. So here we say income minus expenses. We can use minus here. We can also use plus, right? But you can do these simple mathematical you can use those operators, right? So here, this will produce a result, 5,000 minus 2,000. This gives us 3,000, and it's going to assign that to balance here, right? And that's what we're logging here, balance. That's how this works. You can also use plus here. It doesn't make any sense, but if I would do this, what do we get? We get 7,000 here. You can also use multiplication. We'll talk more about operators. Right here, I have a section dedicated to operators. It's not really important for now. This is just very basic, but this is really the fundamentals of a function, right? So the browser will go top and bottom as it sees these lines, a function specification, and only when you call it will it run the statements in there, right? And these days, the modern applications that you're going to write as a JavaScript developer are basically a lot of functions, right? So it has become quite functional, because maybe you've heard of the term object-oriented programming, OOP. Maybe you're coming from a different language, like Java, which is a completely separate language from JavaScript. It's just a coincidence, essentially, that they have the same name or similar name. Java is very OOP, so it's all about objects and classes and things like that. In JavaScript these days, in the JavaScript world, it's not really about OOP and classes. It's more about functions, actually, right? So you'll see it's quite functional, right? So we'll practice with these functions a lot. Now let's make it a little bit more interesting here, because here we're sort of hard coding income and expenses in the function body. But more realistic would be that we actually pass this as input to the function. So a function can have input. So let me actually make this full screen for a second. So for example, maybe this function is expecting income. Right, so let me actually undo this, Control Z. Let's say only the income is what we pass. So here it will expect an input, meaning when you call the function, you actually provide an argument, as it's called. Right, so the argument or input to this function is 5,000. Right, so let's see what happens here. So the browser will receive the script. Eventually it will execute the script. So it's going to go line by line. These are all comments, so that's not going to be interesting. Here it sees it needs to create a function here called calculate balance, and it expects an input. And we call that input, or this parameter, right? So these are all terms, input, parameter, argument. These all refer to a similar thing here, basically just an input to the function. It's called income, and we can refer to that as that name here, right? Expenses is still what we create in the function here. So now when you call it, you can pass an input, 5,000. So when you call the function, it's going to take this 5,000, it's going to assign it to income, right? So then you can refer to that 5,000 here by just using the word income, right? That's how this works. So now if I save here and refresh, we still see 3,000. But now when I make it 10,000, for example, as the income and refresh, we see 8,000, right? So now this function becomes a little bit more dynamic. Instead of always hard coding const income is 5,000, now we can let it be determined by by the time we're calling it, essentially, right? We can also call it multiple times, right? Maybe later I want to call it again, but now with a different input, with a different income. So now we have maybe 1,000 as income. So now what's going to happen, right? Top from bottom, it's going to create this function in its memory, right? You can think about it like that. It's not gonna run the statements in there yet. Only when it gets to this line will it start running the statements in the function. It's going to assign 10,000 to income, right? So then it's going to run the statements. Expenses is 2,000. Here it's going to be 10,000 minus 2,000. It's going to assign the result to balance, and it's going to log the balance. So that's the first log here. And then the function is finished. Then we'll continue here to this statement here, and we run the function again. It's going to assign 1,000 to income. So here in this calculation, you'll get a negative number this time, and we see indeed negative 1,000. You can call it as many times as you want. Right? So this is one parameter. Right? We can also, of course, do it with expenses, right? So this is maybe even more realistic because now we're always hard coding expenses to be 2,000, but maybe we want to pass that as a variable here as well, right? So now, or as an input, right? So here we could have 10,000 as income and let's say 5,000 as expenses. And maybe the other one is 1,000 income and 200 expenses, right? So let's see if I save and refresh. Now you'll see that, well, it's actually in line with intuition, right? So we pass 10,000 and 5,000 respectively to income and expenses, right? So it's going to assign 10,000 to income and 5,000 to expenses. So then in the function body, we can use income and expenses. It's going to do the calculation. 10,000 minus 5,000 is 5,000, and it's going to assign it to balance, right? And then we're logging balance, and we get 5,000, right? Then that function is finished. So we're going to continue with this statement here, and then we're running the function again with different inputs, right? Different arguments, right? So a function is just a way of grouping together statements, and we can give it input, right, to make it more dynamic. All right, so last thing I want to say about the fundamentals of functions is that here we're logging something, right? We're logging balance. Now in practice, you want to return something usually. So here we can also write return balance, semicolon. This is also a statement. So here, this result of this calculation, now we're going to return it. So if I save here and now refresh, we don't see anything logged to the console, right? So we're not logging anything to the console here. So now where does this balance, where is this balance now? Where can we get the result here? Well, now we get it back when you call it, right? So now when you call this function, it will return the result of this calculation, right? So we can actually store, we use variables to store something, right? So here we can just say const result is whatever this calculation has given us, right? And let me actually remove this for a second, right? So now in this statement here, we're going to run this function. We're going to give this function certain inputs, right? It's going to assign these numbers to these inputs. It's going to run the statements in here. And in this line, it's going to return the balance here. So what this will give us, well, in this example, let's see, it will be 10,000 minus 5,000. So balance here will be, so this is the same as just writing 5,000 in this case, right? So we're essentially assigning 5,000 to result here. That's what we're doing. Right, it's functionally equivalent here, right? So then to check it, we can log the result again, right? So I'm going to save here and refresh, and we do indeed see 5,000, right? So you can also return something from a function, right? And maybe I'm going to copy that line and paste it again. Maybe here we have some different numbers. We want to call it again. Maybe we have 2,000 and 100 for expenses. Now here, I'm trying to use the same variable name. Right, you cannot do that, right? So a variable name should be unique. So I can just say this is result number 2, and I can log result number 2 here. And if I then refresh here, we get 1900, right? Which is indeed what you would expect, right? So this is functions in a nutshell. It's just a way of grouping together statements, right? We have two statements here, We don't want to run these statements immediately as the script gets executed. No, we want to run these functions at a later point when we explicitly call the function. The function can get input and it can return something. All right, now there's also some innovation for functions, and you have to know this is called a function declaration, the syntax here. And then there's also, let me actually make this a little bit easier. So let's keep one result here. All right, here we're just calling the function, storing the result in a variable called result and unlocking that. But this function syntax is called a function declaration. And sometimes you will also see something called a function expression. Writing function and then the name for that function like this, you actually create a variable. And so this is a traditional function, so I'm going to use the old school var keyword. This is how people did it in the day and back in the day, and you'll still see this sometimes. The name of the function, so you would write name of the function here, and then that's a variable, right? And then you would use an anonymous function, right? So a function without a name, right? And then the parameters, everything else stays the same, right? So here the statements in that function would be the same, and then since we're assigning something to a variable here, we're creating a new variable, then assigning something to that. That's actually a statement. So here we would actually write a semicolon here. It's slightly different syntax, right? So instead of having function and then the name for the function like this, you actually create a variable with that name. And then you have a function here without a name, right? So this function has no name. It's called an anonymous function, but we're assigning that to a variable called calculate balance. Because of that, it still has a name essentially. The browser can still derive a name from it. We're assigning it to calculate balance, and then we can still use that here, right? So if I try using this here, if I refresh here, we still get a result here, right? Which is actually the correct result, right? It's just a different syntax, right? So this is a function declaration, without variable, with just the name of the function after the keyword function. This is the most common syntax. And then you have function expression, where it's an anonymous function, you're assigning it to some variable. Okay, so this is all still traditional functions, these two, right? Function declaration, function expression. But these days we also have something called arrow functions, right? So let me show you how that works, an arrow function. So the name already says that it has something to do with arrow. So let's try writing these functions in the arrow function syntax. So here I would use const and then calculate balance. Now, instead of using the function keyword, you still have parentheses here, but then you would use an arrow, right? Sort of a fat arrow, also called fat arrow. It looks like an arrow. And then you still have opening and closing curly braces, and the statements in there are the same, right? So a function is just a way of grouping together statements, right? So we still want to run the same statements and then a semicolon at the end, right? So it's actually quite similar to the function expression, because here we have an anonymous function, right? So this is like this, right? This is a function, this, and this is a function. It just doesn't have a name, but because we are assigning it to a new variable created with the const keyword, right? This is the modern syntax these days, called calculate balance. We can still invoke that function. We can still execute the function by using that name, right? And the syntax looks a bit confusing because here we have an equal sign and then here we have another equal sign. So it always looks a bit strange perhaps, but you have to understand this is just a function. We don't have to write the function keyword anymore. So it's a bit shorter. And we are assigning that to a variable called calculate balance. Now, what about the parameters here? You would just write that in these parentheses like before, right? So the inputs are still here, right? So if you look at the difference now, we have essentially removed the function keyword here and replaced it with this arrow sign. So it's a bit shorter syntax, so it's a bit quicker to write, but it's not a huge difference, right? But let's actually try if this let's see if this actually works. So now if I refresh, we still see 5,000. Let's actually change this from 5,000 income and let's say 2,000 expenses. Let's save here and refresh. We still get 3,000. So it still works, right? This is still what it should be. All right, now one big difference with arrow function is actually that we can make it even shorter. What we did so far in every function here is we're creating a new variable called balance, right? So we're making this calculation, assigning it to a new variable called balance, and then a second statement to return the variable balance. We don't have to do that in two statements. We can also just do that in one statement here. Right? So we don't have to create a whole new variable, assign it to that variable. We can also just do this like this. And so just make the calculation, income minus expenses, and then immediately return it, right? This is actually how you would do it probably in the real world, right? So let me also change that, right? So income minus expenses, whatever the result of that is, just immediately return it. Here as well, we don't have to create a whole new variable balance. Just immediately return the result of this, right? So if we try this and refresh, it still works. Okay, so we can do that with every function. Now, if you have a one-liner like this in an arrow function, you can also write this on one line. So what you can do here is I can remove the curly brace here. I can put all of this on one line and remove the curly brace here and semicolon at the end, but there should still be one semicolon left. And now I can even remove the return keyword because if you write it on one line like this without the curly braces, the browser will know that it's you intend to return this. So it's an implicit return. You don't have to explicitly use the return keyword. So now if we try this, save and refresh, we still get 3000. Like if I make it 1500, save and refresh, I still get 500. So it still works. But this is much shorter syntax. And this is really nice if you, in certain circumstances, we'll talk about what those are. I don't want to confuse you too much, but it's very short syntax compared to what we had before, right? So you can make the comparison here. We don't have to write the function keyword here, right? No function keyword. We do have the fat arrow, but it's just, 2 characters. And we have no curly braces, and we don't have the return keyword. Right, so it's much shorter syntax. It looks very confusing, but you have to understand this is the function. What I have selected now is a function. It's an anonymous function, doesn't have a name, but we are assigning that to a variable called calculate price. So then we can still use that's what the name is still invert from that, you could say. So we can use that name like this, like before. All right, so here we have 2 parameters, right? But if you have one parameter, maybe we're just going to hard code expenses to be 500. It's always 500 expense. And we only pass in the income, right? So now we just have one. If you have one parameter, you can even leave off the parentheses, right? So if I do this, what should we get here? Well, this is the function. You can see how short it is. So it's going to receive an input here, right? Which will be 1000 in this case. So it will assign 1000 to income. And then since it's on the same line, it's gonna return the result of this, which is 1000 minus 500. Let's actually make it 2000. So now 2000 will be assigned to income. It's going to return whatever the result is of this, 2000 minus 500, which is 1500. So if I refresh, we get 1500. Okay, so that's the modern syntax. We will practice with this a lot. You will also still often see function declaration. So we're also going to practice with this a lot, right? So I would say these are the 2 most common syntaxes that you're going to see. Function expressions, you'll see this sometimes, but typically people have completely replaced the function expressions with arrow function syntax. Right, so this was functions, right? So functions is just a way of grouping together statements in the function body. Could be many statements. They can have inputs, and you can use those names then in those statements in the function body, and they can also return something, right? But mostly you can think about it as grouping together statements. And if you have one statement, only one statement, like here, in an arrow function, you can write it on one line, right? And if you only have one input, one parameter, you can leave off the parentheses. And if you have no inputs, no parameters, you only have to write 2 parentheses like this, right? So now you have no, maybe it's always 1000 minus 500. Let's actually try this. Right, so now I'm trying to call the function with an input, but there's nothing here to assign the 2000 to. So here we're not going to have an argument, right? So, but we are still doing some kind of calculation here, right? This is a function. And since it's on one line, it knows that it should be returned, right? So it's 1000 minus 500. So you get back 500 here, right? When you call the function, you will get 500 in the result. So if I save here and refresh, we get 500. All right, so maybe one last thing about returning something. What happens if you don't return it, right? So if I just have some function here, so here we're always returning it. Why am I talking about returning? Why don't I just write this? What if we do this? And now call calculate balance and console log results. What do we get here? So what do we get if we do this? If I refresh here, we just get undefined. So here we are doing the calculate. When you call this function, it will still run this statement, right? Actually, let's give it an input. So here it's expecting 2 inputs, right? Income and expenses. So maybe that's what I did wrong. So maybe that's why it didn't work. So let's see. No, we still get undefined. Right, so here it's still assigning 1000 to income, 500 to expenses. It's still going to do that calculation, 1000 minus 500, which is indeed 500, right? So this will be 500. And then that's the end of the statement. Then what? Well, nothing. Right? It will just, the function is finished. It has done the calculation, but it doesn't give us the 5,000 here. So nothing will get assigned to the variable result here, right? So it's still undefined then when we log it. And that's why we get undefined. Right? So that's why you need to return something. So here, if you want to continue with the result of that, you actually want to store the result of that calculation in a variable here. You have to return that. Right? Otherwise, this calling of the function here doesn't return anything. It doesn't give us 500 here. Right? So if we do this with the return keyword, we actually return something here. Right? So that's why returning something can be important. Okay, let me clean up a little bit here. I'm going to remove this, and I'll leave these functions as comments here so we can compare them, and here to make them all equivalent they need their parameters here as well. Right, so these are all essentially equivalent. There are some very subtle differences, but it's more of an advanced topic. But you know, as a beginner, even as an intermediate developer, this is all you need to know about functions. And don't worry, functions are probably one of the trickiest parts for a beginner, so completely normal if you're a little bit confused by them. We'll practice with them a lot. Right, so these were traditionally used very often. These days you see a lot of the arrow function. You still see a lot of function declarations as well. Right? Function expressions, not so much. All right, let's continue with interacting with HTML and CSS. Another word for this is DOM manipulation. So if we want to change something here in the document, right, this HTML you can see as the document, we can do some DOM manipulation. Now, by the way, if I type something here like hello, just a word here, it doesn't work. So if I save here and refresh, the browser will let us know that there's a problem here. By logging something here to the console, it will say hello is not defined, we get an error, right? Because we have not created hello. However, if I write console here and save and refresh, we don't get an error because the browser gives us a console. It's actually an object. We'll talk more about that later. The browser gives us this so that we can sort of interact with this console here from our JavaScript, right? So we can log something. We can log the number 1. If I save here, we see 1 being logged, right? So the browser gives us console so we can interact with this console here. But we want to interact with this part here, you could say, right? So the HTML. So another object that the browser gives us is a document. So if I refresh here, we also don't get an error, right? So document exists. We haven't created it. It's the browser that gives us this, right? And this document represents the HTML, right? So it's an object. So it's also called the document object model, right? DOM for short, and we can do many things with this. Now, one thing we've already seen, we can use document, and then we can get a reference to one of these elements in the HTML, right? So we've selected this element before by using its class name balance number, right? That's this what we see here, right? Let's try changing this first heading here. So we can use first heading, so we need to get a reference to it. So it's an object, it looks a bit strange, but to select something it's called query selector. And this is actually a function, and a function can have inputs, right? So the input here is gonna be a selector to select a particular HTML element. So we can use first heading here. Well, it's a class, so it's dot first heading, right? So we're using CSS classes here actually. So this will give us a reference to that HTML element, right? It will return an HTML element, and we want to do something with that HTML element. We want to store it, right? So we're going to create a variable here to store that in, and we can call that heading, and I like to append L to the variable name to indicate that we're working with an HTML element, right? So this will give us, let me make it full screen, will return a reference to this first heading h1 element, right? So it will give some kind of representation of that here, and that's what we're assigning to this variable heading L, right? So then with heading L, we can do all sorts of fun stuff. We can say the text content of that element should not be your balance, which it is now. We can say that should be it should be blah blah, right? Just something silly. If I save here and refresh, we've changed that to blah blah now. In the HTML, here it's still your balance initially. But as soon as this script runs, eventually it gets to these lines and it will change that into blah blah. Now this is not very useful, this is a bit silly, and typically this is not how it works. So typically you wouldn't just randomly change the text content. Let me undo this and save here. Usually you do it in response to an event, or basically when the user does something, we want to do something. So let's say the user clicks on something. This is the most common event that you want to deal with. So when I move my mouse here, for example, there are events happening. We just don't do anything with them. If I click here, there is an event going on, and we're not doing anything with that yet, so nothing happens. But let's say we do want to do something when the user clicks on this number here. So now we need to get a reference to this element again, balance number. So the browser gives us this document object, and one of the things we can do with that is select an element with .query selector, and it needs to get a CSS selector. So let's see, balance number, balance dash number. We're going to store that in a variable called number L. Well, let's make it balance L. And now what we can do is we can say if there is a click on that element. So we say balance L, and one of the things we can do here is we can start listening for those events, right? So it could be a click, it's very common. Could also be mouse enter. When I enter here with my mouse, that's an event. We can hook into that, right? So we say add event listener. These names look a bit strange perhaps. And now it wants to know which event, right? So we can say the click event. And when that event occurs, let me make it full screen here. When that event occurs, we want to run some statements, right? So maybe we want to run some statements. Balance is 5,000 minus 3,000, and then console log balance. Right, so these are two statements that we want to run, let's say, when there is a click event here. How do we specify now that these are the two statements we want to run? Because that should be the second input here. Do we just sort of awkwardly write that here, right? Do we just write? No. We need to group these statements. What do we use in JavaScript to group statements? We use a function. So here, it actually expects a function, right? And we have basically three options in terms of syntax. Let's use a function declaration. So this is something you're going to see often. So it's function, and then you can give it a name, but here we are only running this function once. We only need it basically for when this click event occurs. So we don't need to give it a name, right? So it's actually optional here to give it a name. We don't need to do that. Right? Here we also haven't done that, right? So here we're having an anonymous function. We're assigning that here, right? So you don't need to give a function a name. It's going to be a function without a name here because we don't need to reference this later, right? So there's no point in giving it a name. Remember, the statements are then in the function body, right? So this is essentially a way of grouping together these statements. This is still one input to this add event listener function. Right? So it's already getting complicated here, don't worry. That's normal to feel a bit confused there. But what we're saying here is when there is a click event on this balance, run this function, meaning run the statements in the function, these two statements. So let's see what happens. If I refresh now and I click on the balance number, we do indeed see something here. Right? We see that we are logging something. So these statements are indeed being run when we click here. We could give this a name, right? So we could call this a common name for these type of functions is called, this is an event handler. We're handling the click event. So common name would be something like click handler, right? And we work the same way. Now when I click here, we get 2000, right? So it still works the same way, but we don't need to, we don't need this name later. We're never going to call click handler later like this, right? It's only just here for this add event listener stuff. All right, so this is a function. This is the traditional function here. So how can we now convert this to an arrow function, the modern syntax? Well, remember, it's just we can remove the function keyword, and now we need to add that fat arrow as it's called, right? So now it's the same way. This is a function. Also, an anonymous function doesn't have a name, has these statements in there. So now if I refresh and click on this number, we still see 2000. Now, what if we click on this number and we want to change the number here, right? So whenever I click, by the way, it keeps logging this. So it runs this function whenever I click. So I could be clicking 100 times after another, right? In the console here, it will just count this. It's not going to log an individual entry here. It's just going to give you the count. Okay, so let's say if I click on this, we want to change this number to 2000, right? So here we only are logging it. We're logging it around. Let's actually change this number to 2000. So here we already have a reference to that element, right? So we can use the same reference. We can say balance L, and we do it with text content. We can set that to something. We can set that to the balance here, right? So if I refresh now, if I click here, you can see it actually becomes 2000. Right, so this is a very simple example of interacting with the HTML, and we'll see much more of this when we start coding this complete project step by step. For example, when we click on this transaction here, we want to remove this transaction. So that's a click event, right? So what we're going to do is when there is a click on this element here, we want to run some statements, right? Here, when we type something here, and we click on the add button here, this form will get submitted. That's a submit event. So we're going to hook with add event listener, we're going to hook into the form's submit event. And when that event occurs, we're going to run a function, meaning the statements in a function. And that's really how websites and web apps work. Even the most complicated web apps, that's usually how it works, right? So the user is going to do something like clicking something, submitting a form, scrolling, moving their mouse around. And sometimes you want to hook into one of those things that the user is doing. Most commonly click or submitting a form, and basically you want to run some statements when the user does something. That's basically how modern websites and web apps work. Or actually, that's how they've always worked. Now, of course, it can get much more complicated in these functions, right? So we can have many more statements, many more things we could be doing. Okay, so this is just changing the HTML a little bit. How about changing the CSS? So I'm going to remove these statements. So it's still the same format here, right? So we want to do something, let's say when there is a click on the number, but now let's say we want to make the number a different color, right? So this is a different statement. The function will stay the same, right? We're using an arrow function here. I can also change this back to just function. So we just use the function keyword without this fat arrow. So here we can also now change we actually have two options in JavaScript to manipulate the CSS. So we have this balance L, we still have a reference to that. And now a quick and dirty way is not to use text content, but we can also use .style. Right, so here we get access actually to all the CSS properties. So we have style, and then we can say, for example, the font size. Right, so in CSS you would write font dash size. Into JavaScript it's like this, font size. You also get access to, right, so we can say color should be, let's say, right, that's actually what we're going to do, something like this. When we start coding this web app properly, we're going to make it red when the balance is negative, right? So this is quite realistic actually. So now if I save here and refresh, if I now click here, you can see the color becomes red, right? So with style, you essentially get access to all of these CSS properties, right? Top, background, width, min height, text align. I can use all of that here as well, text align, but if you have this in the CSS, it becomes the camel case version. Background, it all works through the style here. Now this is not a best practice because, let me undo this. Let's say we want to change many things. So we may also want to change the font size to, let's say, right, and maybe also, let's see, font weight, right? Another thing you want to do with text sometimes, font weight. Maybe this should become even bolder, 700, right? So here we now have three statements here, and if we save here and refresh, now if I click, you can see it becomes bigger. The font weight doesn't actually change. Maybe it didn't even change. Maybe this should be 800, but you can see we're changing a bunch of stuff here. The downside of this is now we are sort of littering our JavaScript with CSS, right? And typically you want to have a clean separation of them. So better to create a class for that separately, right? So here we could have something like balance number, some kind of special class. I'm using BEM notation here, by the way. Right, so then we would have color, font size, font weight. This is the second option of manipulating the CSS. We can just specify that here, color red, font size 50 pixels, 800, let's say. And so now I've combined all of this styling to one class, one rule set here, and then we can use this class name. And so instead of littering our JavaScript with all of these CSS values, the only thing we're going to do here is change the class. So we can add and remove classes to a particular element, right? So this balance number right now has one class, balance number, but now we're also going to add this class to its list of classes. We can add and remove classes. So here we're going to add a class, and the class is called balance number dash dash special, right? Not with a dot, right? Because it already knows it's a class, right? Class list. So we don't have to specify that it's a class, right? So now when I refresh, I click here, it doesn't become bigger. Did I make a typo here? Let's see. It doesn't become bigger because this is actually coming before the balance number class. And so it already has this class, and here I'm trying to where it already has a font size set. And now I'm setting the font size with another class, so there's going to be a clash. But that other class is here, it comes later. And in CSS, if it comes later, it has a preference, right? So this is going to win that clash, right? So that's specificity. So we have to make sure that this comes actually after the other class. Balance number, right? That's a CSS issue. So let me do this again. So now if I click here, you can see it becomes font size 50 pixels indeed, right? But now these styles are confined to this class. It's a bit cleaner because now we only have to change the class, and we don't have all of these random CSS values littered all over our JavaScript, right? So this is typically, I would say, a best practice if you want to manipulate the CSS, right? And we're using a traditional function here. You can also use an arrow function like this, right? Still works. There's one more thing I want to show you with manipulating the HTML. So we've seen text content, right? So let's say balance L, we can use text content we can set that to something. Right, so let's see. We can also just use the number here by number 2000, and it will just make this 2000. It will actually convert this to a string, or it will actually insert this as just plain text. So you can write it like this or this. Doesn't really matter here. Get the same result. Right. Typically, you want to assign a string to this. Right. So here, instead of 2000, we could also say unavailable. Right. So if we save here, we get the text unavailable. Right. So we can use text content well to change the text content of this balance number element, and you can actually see that. So if you would go back into the HTML here, let's see. Yeah, so here now in the elements tab, if you look up the balance number, it actually has changed. Right? So this is showing you the latest HTML. The HTML in our file here is the initial HTML, right? So here it still shows 5000, but as soon as the script runs, it will change that to the string unavailable, right? So this shows you the latest, right? So we've taken this element balance number and we've changed the text content here. Now, sometimes what you want to do is you want to create an HTML element, right? So maybe you want to wrap this in a span, right? So here we're going to say this span, and maybe this span has a certain class, right? The class is maybe some kind of special class, maybe special styling. Maybe that's what we want to do. Let me make it full screen here. So we want to wrap this in a span now. And by the way, I'm using double quotation here because here we're already using singular, right? So if I would use singular here, it thinks this would be one string, and then this would be one string, and it has this weird special, right? So if you have strings in a string, you have to alternate between them. That's a different story. We're trying to insert this as we're trying to make this the text content, right? And the intention here is that we actually create an HTML element here. Can we just do this? So what will happen is it will actually will literally write out span here. Right, so here you can see here in the elements tab, it does not create an element out of this span here where we write. It will actually literally write span as text here, as text content. Right, that's what text content is. So the another option you have is inner HTML. So this works the same, but now if you write some kind of span or some kind of HTML element, if we refresh here, you can see we don't have that span. It actually created an HTML element out of this. If I scroll down a little bit, you can see we now actually have this span here, another span with a class of special. Right, so the browser will parse this now as HTML, and it will actually create an HTML element out of this span stuff here. Right, so that's the difference between inner HTML and text content, because sometimes you actually want to insert actual HTML element. Right, so you can use inner HTML for that. Now we are replacing the number 5000 now with whatever we wrote here. Right, so if I undo this, I'm gonna comment this out. Right, so initially we have 5000, and now we're replacing that. Right, we're setting the inner HTML again. But sometimes we don't want to replace it. We just want to add something below it or in front of or on top of it. For example, here in this list of transactions, we're gonna insert some HTML to create this like an entry here in this list. We don't want to replace the current existing transactions with a new one. We just want to add something to the list, right? So in that case, we wouldn't be using inner HTML. We would say insert. We want to add something adjacent to the already existing HTML. So you would say insert adjacent HTML, and this is not with assigning something. This is, let me make it full screen here. This is just a function. So here we need to specify two things: where it should be inserted, after the beginning, after the end, before the beginning, before the end. So you can imagine here in the list of transactions, we would add something right before the end. So every new entry would get placed at the end. And so here we would say before end, and then the actual HTML that we want to insert. And let me actually comment this out because now we still have unavailable here. Right, so this is what we have. And now let's say we want to add something after the 5000 number. We want to insert some HTML. So then here we could have a string with span, maybe some number 2000, right? So if we do this and refresh, we will get 2000 after it. And if I right click on that and click on inspect, you can see it actually has parsed that as HTML. So now we have a span with 2000. This looks a bit strange here, of course. We have those three options: text content, inner HTML, and insert adjacent HTML. Those are very common ways of inserting some content in the HTML, and we'll practice with that as well. All right, let's move on to scoping and hoisting. I'm gonna remove this. I'm gonna save here, refresh. Okay, so we have a clean slate, console. Okay, so if I have a function here, add transaction, right? Just a function declaration. And in here, I'm going to create a variable amount is, right? So I'm assigning the number 5,000 to a new variable amount. Can I access amount here? Can I log amount here? Let's see what happens. So here, no. So what you have to understand with const and with let as well, by the way, these variables are scoped to their nearest block. Right, so in the curly braces, I can access amount, but not outside. Right, so I can move here, I can move it here, and it works. Oh, well, we should actually call the function, right? Add transaction. If I save here and refresh, it actually works, right? So I can access the number in the variable in here. I cannot access it out here. If I do this, we get an error, right? And the code editor actually helps us out. Right? So it's sort of changing the color here to indicate, hey, you're not using this variable anywhere now, so why are you creating it, right? Even though we're trying to log it here, but it already knows you cannot do that. And if I move it out of here, I can of course also access it, right? So this also works, of course. Right, so this can be a bit tricky sometimes. We're gonna see if-else statements in a second, but we will have something like the following as well. So we could have something like if 1,000 is more than 500. Maybe in this block, we'll go in this block and we're creating a variable. I cannot access that variable in here, right? So if I refresh, we still get an error because again, it's a const, it's scoped to these curly braces. Right? So whenever you see these curly braces, that's a block. And const and let as well, they are scoped to that. So you cannot access them out of there, right? But don't worry, we'll talk about if-else statements in a second, right? So same with arrow functions, calculate price. If I have an arrow function here, const amount is 5,000. Even if I call the function here, I cannot access it out of there, right? Because it's scoped to this. Actually, it's in line with your intuition, right? It makes sense. Save here, refresh, we still get this error. Okay, now what about var? Right, so what if I make this var, the old school var? If I do this, it actually also doesn't work. Right? So var in a function is also scoped to its block, to the curly braces. There's one tricky part with var though, which is if we have some kind of other block, very common, for example, with if-else statements, right? So this is also a block, right? So we'll talk about if-else statements, but essentially, if this is true, if this produces a true value, we go in this block, right? These curly braces. Now, before, if you create some kind of variable in that block, if I save here and refresh, you cannot access it out of there, right? Same with let, right? So const and let are always scoped to their nearest block, the curly braces. However, sometimes people use var, and var is only scoped in those function blocks. So whenever you have a different block, like if else, but we'll see other ones as well, it is not scoped to that. So I actually can access amount outside this block here, right? And that's actually quite tricky if you think about it. It actually is a bit unexpected, right? So var is very loose. I can reassign this variable, right? I can say it's 2,000, it's 3,000 now. Right, so now it's, what do we get? We get 3,000, right? So we have reassigned this, a new value. We can also access it out of, right? So var is quite loose, right? So it's not really strict. And it can cause a lot of unintended consequences in your application. That's one of the reasons why people typically want to stick to const, because it's more strict. I cannot reassign something to it. It's also scoped to this nearest block here. I cannot accidentally access it out of this block, right? I cannot accidentally override it. So it's more strict. Same with let. Let I can override, but let is also scoped to this block. Okay, so that's scoping. That's all you need to know about scoping for now. Let me undo this. So there's also the concept of hoisting. So let's say I have a function here, additional function, calculate balance, let's say, right? And I'm doing something here, right? There's some variable called a is 100 and then maybe logging. Okay, so far what I've done is always create the function first and then we call the function, right? So if I do this, we see 100. But can I also call the function here? Will this work as well? Right, so let's see what happens. If I refresh, we still see 100, right? That's not just from the previous one. Let's change it. It's 200, right? So it still works. And that's because these traditional functions, I should be more specific, the function declaration, this is a function declaration, they get hoisted as it's called, meaning you can imagine as if they were put at the top of the script file, right? So then it's still essentially the same as just calling it like before, like this, right? So these are the function declarations are hoisted, right? That's not the same with arrow functions, right? So const calculate balance. If I make this an arrow function, right? This still works. Now let's try doing this and refresh. See, now we get an error, right? Because essentially this may still be a function, right? This may still be a function, but we're assigning that to a variable, right? With the const keyword, and these const variables do not get hoisted like that, right? So also, if I just make this a variable here, 5000, if I try logging that here, we will get the same error, right? So if I do this, we will get the same error, right? Same with same issue with let. Let's see what we get here actually. So let's see if I refresh, right? You cannot do that. You cannot try accessing it before you've initialized it, right? With var, if I save here and refresh, you can actually access this variable, but it will not have the value set to it, right? So with var, it also gets hoisted. It will basically be like this, var balance, and then only later, and then you're logging it. Well, it still doesn't have a value. And then later, there's a value assigned to it, right? So here it will still be undefined, and then only after that will it have that value in there. Right, so far again, look, works a bit tricky here, you could say. So better to just stick to const and let, because they work as you would expect, right, in many of these situations. Right, so this is all you need to know about scoping and hoisting for now. All right, let's talk about string concatenation and template literals. So you can imagine that we could have some kind of string, so balance text, and we could have something like your balance, and then we want to have some kind of number, right? So let's say we have another variable here, balance, let's say 3000. Your balance is colon, and then I want to use the actual balance number. So can I just write balance number like this? Right, whatever the balance number variable is, that's what I want to use here. It could be 3000, could be 8000, whatever it is. Can I just write it like that? Well, let's see what we get. Console log balance text. So if I save here and refresh, we're gonna get your balance is colon, well, literally balance number. So we don't see, we should see 8000 here. That's what we want, right? We don't see that. So what you can do is you can use string concatenation. So you can have a string and you can say plus balance number, right? So if you do this and refresh, you actually get the number 8000. Right? So you can use plus not only with mathematical calculations, right? Here it sees a string and then plus a number, right? So it will know to sort of combine them into a new string, and that's what we get here, right? You can imagine we have to do something like this in our application, right? This is called string concatenation. Now we also have some innovation here. It's called template literals. So here, let me actually comment this out. We can also have balance text and then with backticks, right? So this is not quotes, these are backticks. Your balance is colon, and then we want to use that balance number. So to sort of interpolate that, you have the $sign and then curly braces, and then you have balance number. Right, so now everything stays within the backticks here. So you don't have these, maybe strange plus sign here with the space. It's all in the backticks, but in the backticks you have to use this $sign curly braces to get the actual variable value. And now this is also what we get. And so this also works. Change it to 5000, it still works. Right, so this is called a template literal, and you can see it's very similar, but everything stays in the backticks now. And one of the advantages of this is, especially if you have multiple lines of text, right? So as we'll see, for example, we're going to insert a transaction element here from our JavaScript, right? So that will be quite a bit of HTML. It has a description, it has some number here, it has some delete button, right? So now you're working across multiple lines, right? So that's going to look something like this, right? So that could be an li that we want to insert, li, and that's going to have a bunch of other elements in there, maybe a span, description, maybe another span with the number, right? You can imagine now we have many more lines, or there's much more text to be inserted. And you can also format it like this, right? Maybe even indented, right? So maybe I should mention that this is called indentation. I'm pressing tab here, indentation, right? So this is especially useful, this template literal, if you have multiple lines of content. And usually that happens when you want to insert some HTML into the document, right? So we'll see examples of this as well. All right. Right, so string concatenation was the old school way of doing it, I guess you could say. You can still use it, and often it is still used, but template literals is the innovation in modern JavaScript. Okay, let's continue with so-called control flow. And here we run into those if-else statements, but there is also some innovation here. I'm going to refresh here to reset everything. So here what we could have, for example, is let's say balance. Let's say balance is 2000. And now we can use maybe if else. So if the balance is more than 0, so if it's positive balance, maybe we can log, right? That's the only statement we want to run. You write else, we want to log negative, right? So here, let's actually see what we get. So if I refresh here, we get positive. So what happens in these if else statements? We have if, and then in the parentheses we have a condition. If this condition evaluates to true, we go in this block. If this condition evaluates to false, we go in this else block, and we run the statements in that block, right? So here balance is 2000. So it's gonna say if 2000 is more than 0, that's what this means, greater than, right? Greater than 0, this will evaluate to true, of course. And so we run the statement in this block, right? Block being these curly braces, whatever's in the curly braces. And if that is false, we don't run this statement, we run the other statement. So here I can also say if balance is less than 0, right? So now it will be like this: 2000 is less than 0. Well, no, that's false, right? So this will evaluate to false. So we don't run this statement. In fact, instead we're just going to run this statement. So if I refresh now, we get negative, right? Let me change it back to greater than, we get positive. Now often you don't need the else statement, so you can also just write if something is true, just run this, right? It doesn't have to be one statement, it can be multiple statements, right? Statement 2. And I can duplicate this line. If I place my caret here on this line, I can hold Shift Alt down arrow key, and I can duplicate the line like that, and then just change it to statement 3. I will have a separate video, by the way, on the most useful Visual Studio Code shortcuts. We'll talk more about that, but you can see we can run multiple statements, right? That's if else. If else is useful if you have a lot of conditions or a lot of code, right? A lot of statements that you want to run if some condition is true or false. Okay, so what's the innovation here? Let me turn it back to the if else. Now we have an alternative way of writing this with the ternary operator, as it's called. Right, so I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to write the equivalent now in this new modern syntax. So what we can also say, if we can say balance greater than 0, right? You can see it as a question, balance greater than 0. Well, if that is true, console log, let me make it full screen, right? Balance greater than 0. If that is true, console log positive. Otherwise, that's colon, console log, right? Semicolon at the end. Right, so balance greater than 0, well, 2000 is greater than 0, so it's true, right? So it should run this statement here, log this statement here, or run this statement here, right? So if I refresh now, we get positive, right? If it's less than 0, we get negative, right? So this is called the ternary operator with this question mark and the colon. This is very useful if you just have a quick check and you just want to run one statement if something is true or false. All right, so it's called control flow because we're essentially controlling the flow of the code here, right? So if something is true, we go in this block. Otherwise, we go in this block. So we're sort of controlling the flow, right? So it's called control flow. All right, let's continue with operators. So there are a bunch of operators here, and most of them are quite straightforward here. So what we can do, for example, is balance is 1000 plus 2000, right? We've already seen this. I can log balance here. And if I refresh, we get 3000, right? So first it's going to do this operation. The result of that will be assigned, right? So plus is just mathematical addition, right? 3000, this is straightforward. We can also do minus, right? We've already seen this. 1000 minus 500, we get 500, right? So first it will do this operation, and only after that will it assign the result to this variable. Right, this is also called an expression, by the way. And this whole thing is called a statement. Okay, so then we have greater than, we've already seen that. So maybe const balance is 5000. If balance is greater than 3000, then we want to do something, right? Else we want to log false, right? Maybe we can just log true here, console log true. If balance is greater than 3000, we will log true, otherwise false. And we see true here, right? If it's, we can also make it 10,000. And if balance is greater than 10,000, if 5000 is greater than 10,000, which is false. So now if I refresh, we get false here, right? So it doesn't run this statement, it goes in this block and runs this statement, right? We have also seen less than, right? If balance is less than 10,000, that's true. If balance is less than 2000, it's false. Okay, now we also have greater than or equal to, right? So it's greater than or equal to. Right, so if we do this, for example, if balance is greater than 5000, it's false because 5000 is not greater than 5000. But if we do this, greater than or equal to 5000, we get true. We also have less than, right? So we can say if balance is less than 5000, Well, that's false because 5,000 is not less than 5,000. But we can also say if it's less than 5,000 or equal to 5,000, right? So now the equal case also results in true. Okay, so then that's it, greater than and less than. We can also just check if balance is 5,000, but it's not a single equal sign because that's assignment in JavaScript, right? So mathematically, basically, if you want to check if something is actually equal to some value, we use double equal signs. So now we see it's true. Now we also have triple equal signs, and if I refresh here, we still get true. Now there's a subtle difference between them. So let's say this balance here is not the number 5,000, but maybe for some reason it's a string 5,000, right? Maybe it's part of, it has been part of some string. Your balance is, right? Maybe we got it like that. So it's a string saying 5,000, and now we're saying if the string 5,000 is strictly equal to the number 5,000, right? So 3 equal signs is strictly equal. Let's see what we get. We get false. And the reason for this is with 3 equal signs, it takes the type into consideration as well. So this is a number type and this is a string type. So if you do strictly and a strict equality check, it will result in false. However, if you do it with those 2 equal signs, we get true. Because with the 2 equal signs, it doesn't take the type into consideration, right? So 5,000 is 5,000. Loosely said, that's true. If you want to be strict with yourself, well, it's not the exact same because it's a different type. In programming, typically you want to be strict with yourself. So if you have the option between being loose or strict, typically you want to go with the strict route. So in practice, it's a best practice to try to use this strict equality as much as possible instead of the loose equality check, because then we get false, or we get true here, but this may give us some unintended effects in our application. Okay, I'm going to change that back to the number type. Let's see what else we have. We also have the not operator. It's if it's not true, well, let's do it like this. So if balance is, let's say, 5,000, right? So if we do this, we get true. But now what if we do this? So we can also check if it's not true. Now here it's a bit tricky because now we're adding the not in front of the balance 5,000. So you can also wrap this in parentheses here. So if the thing in parentheses here, this will give us true. This will give us true. But now with the not sign here, it will invert that. So this whole thing then becomes false. Right, so let's see what we get. Right, so if balance is, for example, the Boolean true, right? So if we then just use balance, if balance, well, that will be true, right? That will produce true. We get true. But you can also sort of invert that with the exclamation mark, right? So that's this sign, and then we have the logical and or operators. So balance could be 5,000, the number 5,000, and let's say const salary is 1,000. So here what we could check is if balance 5,000 and salary is 1,000, right? So now with the logical operator, both of these sides need to be true in order for the entire thing to be true, right? So if this is true and this is true, only then will the entire thing produce true. And do we go in that block, right? So here, if I refresh, we get true. But now let's say balance, which we say balance is 5,000, which is true. And then let's make the salary, let's say it's equal to 800, which is false. So now the first one is true, but the other one is false. So the entire thing will be false. And so we go in the else block, logging false. Right, so with ampersand, both of them need to be true. We also have the logical or operator. So this is or with 2 pipe symbols here. So if balance is 5,000, which is true, or salary is 800, which is false, the entire thing here will still be true because at least one of the operands, at least one of the sides here was true. Right? So with or, only one of the operands, as they're called, only one of the sides needs to be true. Right? So if I save here and refresh, we get true. Even though the second one here is false, this one was true, so the entire thing becomes true. Okay, let me undo this here, and let's continue with Truthy and Falsy values. So what you're going to see sometimes is that people do this. So let's say we have balance is 5,000, and now what people will do sometimes is just say if balance, right? Just if balance, console log true, else console log false. Right, so what will we get here? because this is a bit strange. We're not saying, you know, if it's greater than something or it's equal to something. We're just saying if balance. If this essentially, it's the same as writing this. If 5,000, well, what do we get here actually? So if I refresh here, you can see we get true here. And this is the concept of truthy and falsy values. So balance here is not explicitly true, right? It's not actually explicitly true, but if we force the browser to make a decision, is this true or false? The browser will say, okay, balance, it's a number 5,000. It's not explicitly true, but it's more in the direction of true than it is in the direction of false. So I'm going to make this truthy. It's kind of true, truthy. So it will be evaluated as true eventually. However, if I have the number 0, what will we get here? If I refresh, we actually get false. So if you force the browser to classify the number 0 as either true or false, it will say, okay, 0, it's more in the direction of false. You know, 0, it's negative, it's empty, you know, it sounds negative. So it's more falsy, it's falsy, right? It's not explicitly false, but it's more in the direction of false. So it's kind of false, falsy. And so it will eventually be evaluated as actually false, right? So you're going to see this quite often actually. The only number that's falsy is actually 0. So even if you use a negative number like negative 5,000, you will still get true here, right? So any other number will still be truthy. Same with a string, by the way. So if I have a string hello, what do we get here? Right, so a string hello will also be evaluated as truthy or as true, right? So it's a truthy value. And that goes for any string actually, except the empty string. So if you have an empty string, this will actually, the browser will make this a false, it will actually see this as a falsy value and so evaluate it as false eventually, right? So this is something you're going to see sometimes. These values are not explicitly true or false, but the browser will still sort of convert them into a true or false result. Most of the time it's truthy, except for empty strings or the number 0. Those are false or falsy. Okay, so then I want to continue with the last concept here before we actually start coding this app. I'm going to refresh here. The loops are very common, very important. It can be a little bit complicated, so don't worry if you don't fully grasp it at first sight. So typically you want to loop something when you have a list of something. So we could have a list of income items or incomes. It could be a list of income. So we could have, you know, income from a salary, 5,000, maybe a side project, 500. Well, let's make it 200. And we sold some item, so we have 50 from that. Let's make it 10. Right, so we have a list of incomes, and maybe we want to do something with each of them. Right, now let's actually try logging some of them just to play around a little bit. So if I do this, I refresh, we get the array, right? If I want to access any of them individually, for example, I want to see the second number, I should not use 2. If I do 2 here, we get the number 10, because remember they start from 0, right? So it's 0, the index 0, 1, 2. So if you want the second element, that one has an index of 1. Let's say we want to loop over the array. We want to go over each element in the array and we want to do something. Very common thing in programming. And this is actually, I would say, the most common reason for wanting to do a loop. You have an array and you want to do something for each element in the array. That's how I already said it, for each element in the array. So what you can do on an array is you can say incomes and then for each, and it's a function, a so-called method. We'll talk more about that in the course. Here we can run some statements for each element, right? So we could have, very silly perhaps, but we will have something like amount, or maybe just amount is, let's keep it simple here. We'll just say const a is hello, right? Just very silly, but just to show you how it works. Const b is, right? These are two statements, right? This is statement 1 and this is statement 3, and maybe we want to log statement 3. Right? We have 3 statements here. Let's say for whatever reason we want to run these 3 statements for each of these elements, right? So here we have for each, and then in here we can specify, well, the statements essentially that we want to run for each one. Now remember, you don't just write statements like loosely in here like this, right? You group statements together in a function. So let's see if we still remember how to write a function here. So you can write a function, the traditional function syntax. We have a function here, we can give it a name, but here it's not a situation where we're not going to use this function later, so we don't need to give it a name. And then we have the curly braces, and then in here we have the statements that we want to run, right? So we can move this up in here, right? So this is a function that will be executed for each element, right? So first we're going to go to this element here, and it's going to run this function. And then we're going to go to this element here and we're going to run this function again. And then we're going to go to this element and this function will be run. So let's see what we get if I save and refresh here. So actually what we will have, well, of course, it's going to log statement 3 actually 3 times because we have 3 elements. This is not really interesting to do, of course. Now what we get here, when we run the function, the browser will actually give us the element that we run it for. And it will give us that actually as an input. We can call that whatever we want. So we can call that income, singular, and then we can just log that here as well, right? So it takes the array for each one. It's going to run this function. So we start with the first one, which is 5,000. The browser will assign this number 5,000 to whatever we write here. We could write blah blah here. We call it income. It will assign 5,000 to whatever we put here. We call it income. And then we can use that word here. So it's going to run these statements. And then when that is finished, will it continue with the next element? It's going to assign 200 to income. It's going to run the statements with that, right? So it will log 200. When that is finished, it's going to go to the third one. It's going to assign 10 to income. So let me refresh here and see what we get. So now we see 5,210. I'm logging hello and hi here, but it doesn't really matter here. So I'm going to remove that, right? So I'm going to save and refresh, right? So this is what we get. Right, so we're going to take the array. For each element in the array, we're going to run this function. So it's going to go over each one. So it's going to start here. It's going to assign 5,000 to whatever name we wrote here. We wrote income, could be anything, right? Could be blah blah, right? And then we would have to use the word blah blah here. If I save here and refresh, we get the same result, right? But typically you want to name the things, a descriptive name. So this function here will be run for 5,000. It's going to assign 5,000 to income, and then it's going to run the statements in the function body. Right. In this case, we only have one statement. It's going to run the statement. Income will be 5,000. We see 5,000, and then so then we go to the next element here. It's going to assign 200 to income, and it's going to run the statements in there. It's going to log 200. And when that is finished, it will go to the next one. It will assign 10 to income, and then it's going to run the statements in the function body again. Now with income being equal to the number 10. Right, and that statement will run and we see 10 and it will be finished, and that's the last one, so it will stop the loop, right? So it will stop this whole operation. Right, so this is a very common thing to do in JavaScript and web development. You have a list, and for each one in the list you want to do something. This is quite straightforward and very simple, but sometimes we want to manipulate these elements. So maybe not just the actual income, but maybe we want to add to each of them. Right, so now if I refresh, we will get all of the elements of the array with 10 added to them, right? So it's going to take the array. For each one, it's going to run this function. It's going to take 5,000, assign it to income. Here we're saying 5,000 plus 10. It's going to log 5,010, right? And then it's going to go do the exact same for all the other elements. Right? So this is very beneficial in many situations, and we will practice with this a lot in the course. And we could also write this as an arrow function, of course. Right? So remember, an arrow function doesn't have the function keyword. Instead, we remove the function keyword and we have this fat arrow, right? So equal sign greater than, essentially. If I save here and refresh, we still get the same result. Now, since this is one input here, we can also remove the parentheses, right? So if I save here and refresh, we still get the same result. Now remember, with arrow functions, if you only have one line here, you can also write this one statement. You can also just write that on one line here. So it becomes even shorter, right? So now this is much shorter. And if I now save and refresh this, we still get the same result, right? So you see that these arrow functions are used most often when you have to supply a function. So here for the for each function, we have to supply a function that we want to run for each element. So you often see arrow functions being used in those situations. Also with add event listener. Yeah, anytime you have to supply a function, these are often, people often use these arrow functions for it. If you're just creating a function, standalone function, to sort of group together your statements and sort of more globally organize your program, people still often use this function declaration syntax, right? But when you have to supply a function, also called a callback function, people often use this arrow function syntax, right? And here it will actually, if you remember it will actually return whatever we put here because it's an implicit return. And here we don't intend to return anything. We just want to log something to the console here, but that doesn't matter. It will still return something here, but that doesn't matter here. It has no impact. Okay, so this is the for each loop. Now, maybe you already knew a little bit about JavaScript. In that case, you will also recognize the for loop. This is a more general purpose loop, but I have to say it has been mostly replaced with a lot of other options that you have these days in JavaScript. Most commonly the for each, what we just saw for arrays, right? So this is more complicated. So don't worry if you don't understand this. I'm gonna refresh here. And let me actually reset everything here. Yeah, so the for loop goes as follows. So let's say we have the for loop, and it looks like this. In here, we're going to run some statements. But before we do that, we need to specify 3 conditions. So, or 3 things here. So usually you have some kind of element that you're going to use to keep track of the loop. So we could have, usually called I. We are going to create that with the let keyword because we're going to reassign it. We're gonna add something after each loop. So we're gonna reassign it on each loop. So it needs to be changed. So we cannot create it with const. We have to create it with let, and we can actually just create it within the parentheses like this as well. So that's no problem. So we have some variable I. It starts at 0. And we want to run this loop as long as I is, let's say, less than 3. After each loop, we're going to increment I by 1. You can write in JavaScript++, which will just add 1 to the variable I after each loop here. So then what we can do is we can run the statements. So, right, so it could be any statement, right? Assign 99 to a variable A, assign the string hello to a variable B, maybe console log something, maybe console log the word hi. So let's just see what we get. This is the for loop. So let's see what we get if we refresh here. So here what we're going to see is it's going to log hi 3 times. Let's see if we can understand the mechanics of this. So initially we have a variable called I, it's going to be 0. And here the second condition is to check if we should run the statements in there. So here we're saying I is less than 3. Well, 0 is less than 3. That's true. So indeed, we should run the statements in here. That's going to run these statements. We see hi being logged. Then that first round is finished. And here we have specified what to do after each round. So it's gonna do I++, which will essentially just add 1 to I. So it's finished. It's gonna add 1 to I. So it's gonna go from 0 to 1, right? So I is 1 now. And now it's gonna check again. Is 1 less than 3? This is true. So we go run these statements again. It's gonna log hi again for the second time, right? That's the end of this of the statements here. So now it's going to increment by 1 again. So now I becomes 2. It's going to check, is 2 less than 3? So we're going to run these statements again. I becomes 3, right? Because it's going to go from 2 to 3. 3 is less than 3. No, that's false. And the loop stops, right? So quite complicated, I would say. Now, practically speaking, these statements are not very useful. Let me refresh here. Typically what you want to do is you want to use that I variable for something. So what we can also do is console log incomes, and then we can use this I variable to access all of those elements in the array, right? So initially I is 0. 0 is less than 3. So we're gonna run the statements. So here what we're gonna log is incomes at index 0, right? We're just using the I variable here in the statements now. That's typically why people use this loop. And now we can incomes at index 0, so we should get 5,000, right? Now I is going to be, that's finished. This loop is now this round is now finished. So now I is going to be 1 is less than 3 is true, right? So now we're going to go run the statements again with I being 1. So we get incomes at index 1. Should get 200, right? And so on. So if now refresh, we're just logging all of these elements in the array, right? So this is a bit more complicated syntax than the for each loop. And so in my opinion, if you have the option, always use for each. The only advantage is, for example, if you have a long list, right? A very long list of elements. And let's say we have thousands or maybe even millions of elements in an array. We don't want to go over, but for each, you're going to go over each one, right? You're literally going over each one element in the array, but sometimes you only want to go over the first, let's say, 100 elements. Yeah, so in this example now we have, let's see, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 elements in the array. Maybe we only want to go over the first 2. Right, so now if I save and refresh, we are only logging the first 2. And it has better performance than if we had to go over each one, despite only being interested in the first 2, let's say. Maybe we only need the first 2. But for each, we would go over each one. But for, we can sort of constrain it better. Right, so this would be an example of where you want to use the for loop. But this is already getting a bit advanced. And I would say even experienced programmers would have to look up how to do that in a performant way. So don't worry if this is unclear to you. The for loop is basically more general purpose because for each you can only use on an array. With for, you can also use it in other circumstances. Alright, so let's try building this web app. We already have the HTML and CSS for our project, but right now, of course, it doesn't work. So if I click on this, well, transaction, for example, it doesn't get removed. So if we look at the example here, when I click on this, it should actually get removed and it should also be reflected in the numbers here, right? So if I look at the example, I refresh here. If I click here, right, you can already hear what I'm saying, click, right? So maybe we need to do something with a click event. If I click here, something happens. Right, so let's actually start there, and then we'll deal with actually adding something here as well. Now let's actually start simple. Let's try adding the ability to remove a transaction. So I'm gonna clean some stuff up here. I'm gonna save here. I'm gonna refresh. Right, so now what we want to do is when we click on this transaction here, that it gets removed both visually as well as reflected in the numbers here. Okay, now you could already hear me say click, right? So here you probably know that we want to deal with a click event here. Now, an event is attached to a particular HTML element. So here, this would be the transaction item here. So let's actually find this in the HTML. So here we have the transactions section. Here we have that heading, and then here we have a list of transactions, and then each transaction is an LI here. So this is an LI with a class of transaction and also a class of transaction dash dash income, right? So if it's a transaction income, it will have this green border here. If it's an expense, and if I would make the HTML like this, it will actually have a red border, right? And in there we have the transaction text, that's the salary, and an amount, right? Plus 5,000. And we also have this button here, which we only see if we hover the transaction item. Right, so that's just CSS. All right, so we want to do something with a click event. So which element should that be? Well, it could be this LI. However, what if we have hundreds of LI items, right? What if we have hundreds? Could have hundreds, many more. Whoops. What if we have many more, right? So if I refresh here, we have many more. We could have hundreds. Should we attach an event listener to all of them individually? Well, you could do that, but it's not the best solution. The best solution, you have to know about these events. The click event, they bubble upwards. So if we click on the LI, it starts here, but then it also goes up one level to the UL, and then it goes up another level to the section here, all the way until the root element, the HTML element. Right, so these events, they bubble upwards as it's called. So we can also catch them, you could say, at a higher level to this UL. So we only have to attach an event listener to one element instead of to the hundreds of potential list items. Right, so we're gonna catch the event at this level. This is called event delegation. So we're gonna go to transactions. This is the element that we're gonna attach it to. So first we need to get a reference. Okay, so we have transactions. L, I like to append L to the variable name if we're storing an HTML element in there, right? And then we can use the document that we get from the browser, and we can use .query selector on that. And then we can just use a CSS selector, .transactions, right? That's this UL, right? And then on that element, transactions L, we can add an event listener. We can start listening for particular events. And there could be other events, could be mouse enter event, mouse leave event. But here it's going to be specifically the click event. And when that event occurs, we want to run some statements. And we don't just loosely specify statements here. We group the statements together in a function. So we're going to run a particular function. I will use the traditional syntax here. So it's just going to be a function, keyword, parentheses, and then we have these curly braces. Right, so this is what it looks now. And let's just try logging something as the first statement just to see if it's working. So I'm going to log the number 1 here. So now I'm going to refresh. Right, we only have one LI. I already reset that here from the HTML. So now if we click something here, we see 1. Right, so if we click on this list, now we will see 1. Okay, but what if we have more? Right, so if we have one LI, I'm just going to copy and paste this 2 more times. And now we have 3 LIs. And every time we click on any of them, we always are going to log console1, right? So now the tricky part is, if I click on this third one, let's say, how does it know to remove the third one only and not the other ones? Let's just try removing this LI. It's going to be the last LI. And to do that, we're going to need the event object. So here we specify a function that we want to run when this event occurs. And the browser helps us out a little bit, because as an input to this function, the browser also gives us an object representing the event that just happened, right? So you can call this whatever you want. We can call this blah blah. And then let's see what we get actually. So if I refresh here, if I click here, you can see we actually get an event with information about the event that just occurred. And it shows us client X, client Y, some coordinates on the page of where it happened. And it's showing us all sorts of information. Now, most of the time, you don't really want to do anything with this information, with most of this. Now, there's one other important one here, which is called target, right? So if we say blah blah dot target, let's see what we get. Now, if I click here, for example, you can see we actually get the specific HTML element that was actually clicked, the actual target of the click, right? So if I click very quickly before the button has come down, you can see that it's actually the LI. Right, so the browser gives us an object representing the event, and whatever you call here, the object will be assigned to that. Typically, it is actually just called event, or just E sometimes. Let's call it event. And what we're gonna get, of course, the target here. If we look at the target, I'm gonna refresh here. If I click here, we're always gonna get some button element, right? So we're gonna get this button element. We don't want to get the button. We want to get the LI. We want to remove the complete LI. That's actually the parent element of the button. And what we want to get is not just the target. We want to get its parent element. We can use parent node for that. So if we do this, and now click on this delete button, we actually get the LI, the specific LI that was clicked. And you know that because if you hover this in the console, it will actually show you that on the page. Right, so what we can do here is we can actually say clicked element. Well, that is the event, the target, and then you get the button. We want to get its parent node. A bit of a strange word, parent node. And how do I know this, by the way? How would you solve that in the real world? So you can go to google.com. You would go to Google and you would search for something like JavaScript get parent elements, right? Something like that. And then you would get all sorts of websites. Now, the two common ones that you're going to see are W3 Schools and also MDN by Mozilla. This is typically preferred by many developers. So this is basically a reference for all sorts of things you can do with JavaScript, and also in this document, right, the DOM. And also, of course, you're going to see some blogs. Now, very popular, you're also going to get Stack Overflow. Right, so here, eventually you'll find something like parent node. Right, so that's one way of solving problems that you're going to get. Just Google them and you're going to see blogs, Stack Overflow, MDN. Usually you'll find your answer there. All right, so then we have the actual LI that was clicked, the actual clicked element. And what can we do with that? How to remove that? Well, you can actually just say .remove. This is all functionality that we get from the browser. We get an event object, and on that object we have this information. And then we get an actual reference to the actual element that was clicked. We store that in here. And one thing we can do with that is just call remove. So now if we click here, it will actually remove the third one, right? And the second one and the first one, right? All of this is functionality we get from the browser, right? And often you don't know this beforehand. You actually have to Google some question that you have or something that you want to do, and you'll find over time to remember a lot of this. Right? So I just duplicated this 2 more times just to show you how that would work. But let's actually start with one LI. Now I'm going to remove the other two. Right? So we just have one LI. If we click on it, it gets visually removed. Right? But it's not reflected in those numbers yet. Right? So this is just the first step. I like to add some comments here. Remove transaction item visually. Right? That's the first thing we want to do when there is a click event. Right? So we select, when the script runs, it will give us this reference to that transactions list, and we immediately start listening for a click event, and this function will fire every time there is a click. And every click, it will give us an event object, an object representing the event. So then here, step 1, remove the transaction item visually. So first we're going to get the actual LI that was clicked, and we can call remove on that. Looks a bit strange here with target and parent node. Don't worry about that. That's just how it's called. And now we actually want to update the, let's say, the income number here, right? Or if it was an expense, it should update the expense, right? So here we can say the second thing we want to do, update income or expenses. Right, so I'm going to refresh here, just start from a clean slate again. So first, of course, if we want to remove this, we need to know what the number was, because here the 5,000, we need to subtract that here from the total income here, right? When we click here, we need to be able to get a number from this LI. Now, how can we get that number from that LI? Let's see. So we have the text and the amount. So this number is here in this amount. So we need to get a reference to this element, right? So here we have the clicked element, that's an LI, and now we want to get the transaction amount, the text content from that element. So what we can do is we can get a reference to that element that holds the number by using this clicked element. Right, so here we get the actual clicked LI and the actual clicked L, and in there we want to get this span, transaction amount. So how to get a reference to an element? Well, we've already done that. We've used query selector, right? Now we've done that on the complete document, right? So we're basically saying we're querying the document to select some element with a class of transactions, right? Now here we don't want to search through the entire document, only on in the clicked element, right? So in this clicked element, we can also call query selector. And here it's a class of transaction underscore amount, right? So that will give us this element. It will not give us the number yet. I just a reference to that element. And now what we can get is the actual amount. So just amount. So now we can use that amount L dot text content. Right? So this is amount L is the entire element. We want to get the actual, well, text content in there. Right? That's what we're going to store here in amount. So if we save this and refresh, and let's try logging that, console log amount. So I'm going to save and refresh again. And now I'm going to click here, and it actually gives me plus 5,000. Now there's one problem with this. Is this a string or a number? Because we may need to do some checks or operations on this. And so in certain things, you don't want to use a string. So we actually want this to be a number. So we can check this with type of. So if you write type of in front, it will give you the type. So if I click again, it says, oh, it's a string actually, right? So if you get some number from the DOM, the document, it will give you that as a string, and it's text, it's a string. So we don't want that. Ideally, it's just it's a number type. So how can we convert this? How can we convert this to a number type? Well, you can just write plus in front of it. This is called the unary operator, and it will just convert that from a string to a number type, right? So just to prove that to you, type of amount. I'm gonna save and to refresh, and now if I click, you can see we get a number, right? And what is the actual value we get? So save and refresh. So we get 5,000. You can see it has a different color, and also doesn't have the plus in front of it anymore, right? So it converts that plus 5,000 string to a just 5,000 number. Okay, so now we have the actual amount that we need to subtract from this income, right? So now we want to change the actual income number. So now we also need to get a reference to that income number, right? So let's see, that's here, that's this span with a class of number and also a class of number dash dash income, right? So we need to select this, and we also need to select eventually the expenses number. And let's just select all other elements that we're going to need just to get it over with, because we're also going to deal with a form. And when we submit the form, we want to do something, right? So we could select all of that here again, right? Document query selector, and then get the number income, number expenses, and have a whole list of document.query selector in here. Or it's nice to just sort of collect all the selectors up front at the top. So let's actually do that. And the easiest way, I think, is to just duplicate this line a couple of times, and then we'll change the actual selectors here. So I can place my cursor on this line, or caret on this line, and I can hold Shift Alt down arrow key a couple of times. Let's say we need 7 in total. So I have 6 now. So one more time. So now we have 7. So we have transactions, but we're also going to need the actual balance number. So we'll call that balance number element. And that one has a class of balance dash number. And then we have the actual number for the income. So we'll say number income element. And number income element, that is actually this one. Right, so that has a class of number dash dash income. Of course, we're also going to have the number for the expenses. So we'll say number expenses L. And we'll say this is number dash dash expenses. Okay, and then we'll eventually, after we deal with this click, we're also going to deal with a form submission, right? So we'll have to get access to the form, and it has a class of form. And then we have, we want to get the actual values that the user has input. So we need to get an access, we need to get a reference to both of these inputs as well, because we want to grab whatever the user wrote here. Right, so we're going to have an input description, L, and that has a class of input dash dash description. And we want to get a reference to the input amount, L. And that has a class of input dash dash amount. That's a bit of typing here, and you know, that's the real world. Sometimes you need to type a little bit. And these are all the selectors that we're going to need. So here we're also selecting an element, by the way, with query selector, but this is more specific to the LI, the actual clicked element, the actual clicked LI, right? So this is not just from the whole document. This actually needs to happen after the click. So we cannot just do that here. This needs to happen after the click, and we derive that from the event object, right? Because first we're going to get the list item, the LI that was actually clicked. We store that in here, and then in that LI, we're going to search for that actual amount. Okay, so now we have everything selected that we're going to need. So let's see where we were. So let's see. So there is a click somewhere in this list. We use the event object to get the actual LI list item that was clicked. We store that in here, and it gets removed. Right, gets removed. But now, of course, we want to update these numbers as well. Right, so the income should go down again, and the balance as well. But let's deal with the income first. So here we now have the actual amount element that holds the amount. Right? Let's see in the LI. So that is transaction amount. And then we grab the actual number from that. That's what we have in amount. Now we want to subtract that amount number from this income number. So we just selected all of that, so also this income number. So now we have that number income element. Right, that's the element that holds this number, right? So we can say text content. We can set the text content to something. Right, we could set it, for example, always to 1000. Right, so now when we click here, this income number will always be 1000, but it shouldn't be 1000, of course. It should just be 5000 minus what we just removed. Right, so it should be its current number. Right, so let's say current income number, or just current income. Let's grab the current one first. So that's the number income element that dot text content. Right, so it's just going to grab 5000 in this case, and we'll store that in current income. Right, and then we can say the updated income should be whatever the current income is minus what we just grabbed here, right? Minus that 5000 in this case. And then we can just set the text content to the updated income. Right, so if I refresh here, and now when we click here, we get an error because I made a typo. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to save here and retry that. So now if I click here, yeah, it works, right? So now income becomes 0 because we get the 5,000 here in amount. It's going to get the current income, which was 5,000 initially. The updated income is 5,000 minus 5,000. That's going to be 0, right? And we're assigning 0 to the number income L.text content, right? That's how it works. Okay. Now, this is only when it's a positive number though, right? So here salary it's 5,000. It's a positive number, right? What if there's a transaction with a negative number, for example, for groceries, right? So let me actually add that. We can just add that here, just another LI. And now it's just negative 300, let's say. And this should be groceries, for example, right? I just added another LI here. So then when I refresh, we see this. Of course, it should be a red one. So this is not an income, this is an expense, right? So the second one should get a class of transaction expense. Okay, now when we click here, we still run all of this code, right? So this code runs after every time there's a click. Now we still run all of this code. Now here, of course, we shouldn't change the income, the expenses, right? The expenses should be 300 initially in that case, right? Just 300 initially, right? So then when we click here, it should not be the income number here that should be changed. It should be the expenses number that should be changed, right? And the balance in this case, let's see, the balance in this case, of course, would be 4,700, right? So if we do that, right, so now the whole example makes sense. Let's actually continue with this. I think this is actually a better initial set of data to work with, right? So here, where we get that number from the transaction that we clicked, it was a positive number first, but could also be a negative number. Right? If it's a positive number, we want to change the income. If it's a negative number, we want to change the expense value here. Right? So the code that we just ran, what we just did, the amount, if it's positive, we want to do this. Right? So here we can have an if check. If the amount is more than 0, then we want to run this code. Right? We want to deal with the income number. Else, if it turns out to be the groceries with the negative 300, we will go in here. Let's actually log this to see what we get. All right, I will log a negative number. If I refresh here, if I click on salary, it indeed changes the income number here. If I now click on groceries, we go in here, right? So it doesn't run this code. We still have to write that for the expenses. Now what we want to do for the expenses is actually very similar. So we can actually just copy this code and paste it right here. So in this case, we still want to get the current expenses, not the current income, right? So here we're going to say current expenses. And it's going to get that from this element that holds this number, which is number expenses L.text content, right? And then we can say this is going to be the updated expenses. It's going to be the current expenses minus the amount, right? So currently we had 300 here and we had groceries negative 300. So if I click on groceries, and I remove that transaction, the expenses should become 0 again. So it's going to get the current expenses, which is 300. So it's going to be 300 minus the amount that we grabbed from the transaction element, which is actually negative 300. So it's going to be something like this. Now, if you remember from math, if you have two minuses, that actually becomes a plus. So what we want here, if we have negative 300, we don't want this to be a negative. We want that to be a positive number actually. So this amount, we can convert that to a positive number by multiplying it with negative 1, right? So it's going to be negative 300 times negative 1, which is going to be 300, right? So then it's going to be the current expenses, which is 300 minus 300. So it will become 0, which is indeed what it should be right now, right? And then we just say number, now it needs to be actually updated. So it's number expenses element. And that should be the updated expenses. Right, it's a little bit tricky here with these negative numbers. Let's just see what we get. So if we refresh now, if we click on groceries, it actually becomes 0 here. If I click on salary, it also still becomes 0. Right, it's a little bit tricky here, but that's also the real world sometimes. Right, so this is what we have. Right, so it's already getting quite a bit of code here, and all of this code is running whenever there's a click in the transactions list. So it looks like a lot of code, but of course the computer is very fast, so it can run all of these statements very quickly, one after another. Right, so this is what we want to do when there is a click here. Right, now, okay, so now we are correctly updating these numbers here as well, but now of course the balance should also be updated. So if I remove the salary transaction here, we are indeed resetting the income to 0. But now of course, you know, our balance should be negative 300 here. So now the last step here would also be after a click. Right, so this is all still in the click handler function. The last step here would be to update the balance as well. And this also needs to happen after a click. Now the balance is just taking the income and doing minus the expenses, right? So we can just say the income is just number income L, which will just grab the number from here after we have already updated it. Right, so this comes after we already updated the number income L. So we can just take the most current value by just taking its text content here. This is all sequential, right? So all of this code runs sequentially, right? So here this comes after this block, right? So we can be rest assured that by the time we get to here, this number income L is the most up-to-date number. And remember, this is going to be a string, right? So typically you do want to convert that to a number type. We can use the unary operator for that. And then for the expenses here, and let me actually indent it one time, not twice. So expenses, it's going to be number expenses L dot text content. That's also going to be a string, so we're going to convert that to a number type as well. And then of course we can just set the balance number, which we already selected at the top. We can set its text content to be the income minus the expenses. Right, so let's see. If I refresh here, if I click on salary, it removes the 5,000 from the income and also it updates the balance now. It's negative 300. If I click on groceries, it indeed makes the expenses 0 again and also correctly updates the balance. All right, now one thing we can actually do here, last thing, for example, here if we remove the salary, the balance actually becomes negative. So after updating the balance, we can also check if it's a negative number, we may want to make it as red, for example. Right, so manipulating the CSS. So let's quickly do that as well. So we can just say check if negative balance, or make red if balance negative. So we can say if income minus expenses is less than 0, then we want to take that balance number L. Right, so this is a reference to that HTML element. And now we have two ways of manipulating the CSS. We can use the dot style. This is the quick and dirty way. Or we can work with a class list, right? Adding a class, removing a class. So I will use the quick and dirty way here because it's just one little thing we want to do here. It's a smaller project, so let's do it the easy way. So we can use the style property and then we can use any CSS property we want. So we can just use the color. We can set that to, for example, the built-in CSS color red. Right, so now when we do this, we get a negative number and here it's going to check if the income minus expenses is less than 0, which is true here, right? We're going to get negative 300 is less than 0. So we run this statement, right? We could add something like this, else, but it's not necessary, right? We don't really want to do something if it's not true. We just want to end the function here, right? So you can also just have the if else without the else, right? And if you want to see how this would work with the ternary operator, we could write income minus expenses less than 0, right? Like a question, less than 0, then we want to run this statement, right? Make it red. Otherwise, well, we don't want to do anything, right? So you can write it like this, just an empty string here, no statements in there, nothing, right? So you could also write it like this with a ternary operator. All right. So this is already a lot of code, right? And this is all running every time there's a click. It looks like a lot of code, but a computer is super fast. Right? So a computer will run all of these statements very quickly, one after another. Okay. Now we are writing all of this code here when we add the event listener, right? Now, typically what you also see is that people don't just write it here when we add the event listener, they sort of create its own standalone function to deal with the event, right? And actually give it a name. So we could create a new function here. And typically these things are called click handler or handle click. Call it click handler, right? This is just a function. And here, all of these statements in here, we're going to put that in here now. So all of these statements here, including the comments, I'm going to select all of them, hold Alt, and then up arrow key. You can also just copy paste with your mouse or Control C, Control V. Right, so now all of these statements are here in the click handler. Now we shouldn't forget that the browser will actually give us an object representing the event. We can call it whatever we want, typically just called event. Okay, so now we don't have to write all of that in here. Instead, what we can do is we can just give the function name, right? It's called click handler, right? So here we can just give the function name. Now, a common mistake is that people will actually write this. So this is a common mistake. You shouldn't do this because now when the browser starts running this script, it will go line by line here. And here it sees this function and it will not run the statements in the function, right? We don't want that. We only want to run the statements when this event occurs, right? So the browser will go here and now it will see this line and it will see this. And when you write a function with the opening and closing parentheses, it will run the function immediately. Right? So as soon as it gets to this line, it will run the function because we write it like this. That's not what we want. We want to run the function when this event occurs, right? So we shouldn't execute the function at the point of adding the event listener. We only need to give a reference to the function that we want to run when the event occurs, right? So we're saying execute the click handler function when this event occurs, right? And it knows, oh yeah, that's this function, right? Because we have given this a name now. This is a function declaration. And if we would write this as an arrow function, we can remove the function keyword. We will keep the parameter, and then we have this the fat arrow, right? Now with arrow functions, you do have to use a variable syntax here, right? So we would actually call this click handler, and we would assign this function, right? So this entire thing now is one big function. This is a function. It has a parameter, and it has statements in its function body, right? It has no name, but we're assigning that to this variable click handler, right? So we can still reference it like that, right? So if I do this and refresh, and I remove groceries, it still works, right? Everything still works. All right, so I'm gonna refresh here, and now we can continue with the second part, which is that, of course, we should be able to add these transaction items in the first place. So we could, for example, say book sale. Maybe I sold a book or had sold multiple books and we earned $100 for that. So we can say plus 100 or just 100. And when we click add here, it should of course add that here to the transactions and also update these numbers. Instead, nothing happens like that. The only thing that happens here, since we're submitting a form, is the default browser behavior, which it will sort of refresh the page, right? So that's not what we want at all. Let's deal with this. So remember, it's basically always about an event. So something happens and we want to hook into that. So what is the event that happens here? Is it we could do it with a click event on this button, right? So when there is a click on this add button, we're gonna run the necessary code. But there is also another event that happens on forms, because if we look at the HTML structure here, it's a form, right? And there are two inputs, right? One for the description, one for the amount. They have a label, basically just a description for the input, and then they have a button. Right, so we could hook into this button and we could say when there's a click on this button, we want to do something, but we can also do something with this form. Let's do something with this form. So let's do it here. We could also do it after this one, but I like to be closer to the selectors here so we can easily scroll up and see what we need. So we also selected the form, so we can say form L. We want to listen for a particular event on this element, and this time that's going to be the submit event. Right, so there is a submit event when you click on a submit button in a form. When that event occurs, we want to run some statements, just like here, right? But you group together statements in a function, right? So you have to specify a function here. We'll start with the traditional syntax first. Right, that's like this. This is the function that we're going to run. And the browser will give us an event, an object representing the event. We can call that E or EV, event, or we could just leave it off if we're not going to use it. We don't need to assign it to any name, so we can just leave it off. Right now we don't need it, so let's just leave it off. So this is the basic structure of what we're going to need. So now we want to run some statements when this event occurs. And the statements we're going to write now. Right, so what's the first thing we want to do here? If I just write test here and let's say 100, if I click here, the form gets submitted and we run the statements in here. So the first thing is actually getting rid of this annoying behavior where the browser just sort of refreshes as soon as we submit a form. And we actually do need the event object for that. So the browser will give us the event object. And here we can say prevent that default behavior. Right? So what we can do is we can use that event object and we can actually use event.prevent default. It looks a little bit strange. And it's unfortunate that this is necessary often with forms. So now if I write test and 500, and if I now click on this button and submit the form, you can see we don't have that annoying refreshing behavior anymore. All right, so now what we want, of course, is we need to get these values, right? And then create an li out of them, an li element, and insert that here. But first we need to get these values. So we can say get input values. So we're going to have description. So that's going to be the we already selected that. So the input description element, and we can actually use dot value. Oops, dot value, and it will give us whatever we wrote here. Okay, and then we also want to get the amount. Right, so here we can use input amount element. We already selected that, dot value, and it will give us whatever we wrote here. Now this is going to be a string. Right, so let's also convert this to a number with the unary operator. And let's actually log this. I can log two things at the same time with a comma. All right, so let's see what we get. I'm going to refresh. I can write test here. I can write 300 here. If I now submit the form, we get description, test, and amount 300. Right, so this is working now. We can capture the values that the user input. Okay. So now what we need to do is we need to take those values and we need to create an li out of them. Right, so here we have, let's see. Here we have li for the salary, an li for the groceries, and now we sort of want to get an li for whatever we put in here, right? So what we're going to do is let's actually copy this, right? So let's actually copy the first li here. And then what we want to do is we want to create transaction item HTML. Right, so we need to create the HTML with this description and this amount, and then insert it. Right, that will be the step after this. Whoops. Right, so here, const transaction item HTML. Right. Now here, what we're going to do is we're going to use these backticks. Right, we could use string concatenation, but here we're going to work with quite a few lines. Right, so we're going to work with this li stuff here. It's multiple lines. And it's easier to use these backticks, right? So these are not quotation marks, these are backticks, and I'll put a semicolon here. I'm going to distribute this over multiple lines by just pressing enter. I'm going to go to this line, indent it here, and then I'm going to press space or Control V to paste that LI. I'm going to indent this with tab. Right, just indent it like this. And this is basically what we want to insert, except now, of course, with our actual values that the user input, right? So not salary, but whatever the description is. Now, if you remember that, we can do that with this weird $sign and then curly braces. And then we can use that variable name, description, right? And then, of course, it shouldn't be plus 5,000. It should be whatever the user input, right? So here we're going to remove this 5,000. And we'll say this will be just amount. Okay, so now we have the HTML, right? So we're gonna get this HTML. We're assigning that to this variable. And now we need to insert it, right? So insert new HTML. Okay. So let's see, where do we need to insert this? Well, we want to insert this in the list, right? So we already have selected that. That's transactions L. And we can use insert adjacent, right? So we have multiple options. We have text content. It will replace all of this, and it will not parse this as HTML, which actually it should. So we could use inner HTML, which will parse all of this as actual HTML. It will create HTML elements out of these tags, right? With text content, it will just literally write, LI. With inner HTML, it will actually create an HTML element out of that and also the other ones. But it will replace everything, right? So it's just going to set the inner HTML to this. We're only going to have one LI, right? Because we're going to replace all of this with just this one. Instead, we want to insert something adjacent to the already existing elements. So we're going to use insert adjacent HTML, right? And then it's a function. I'll put a semicolon at the end. And where do we want to insert this? Well, right before the end, right? So right here, right before the end. So here the first input is where, well, before end. And then what do you want to insert? Well, this transaction item HTML. Right, so you can just copy that variable name, just paste it right here. That's what we want to insert. Okay, so this was a bunch of typing. Let's see if this actually works. All right, so now I'm going to refresh. Now I'm going to have a description here. Let's say book sale, and I made $100 from this. I'm just going to write 100. If I now submit this form, we'd see a new LI, right? And you can see it has a nice animation. That's all CSS, by the way, right? So it's really important that you have also mastered CSS as a front-end developer. Definitely check out my CSS course. It's also a link in my description, right? And now you can see this works. And even if I click here, it's already working, right? Because we already solved that issue before. So I'm going to refresh here just to reset here, right? So just to try it again, let's see. Maybe I had a garage sale and I made $500. I'm going to submit the form and we have a nice list item here. Now it would be nice after submitting this form that these inputs also get cleared, because maybe I have other transactions. So I want to immediately go to the next one basically, but this is now still here. Now maybe the next step is clear form inputs, right? And all of this code is running every time you submit a form, right? So it's after this event has occurred, all of this code, this function is run, right? With all the statements in here, right? Okay, so we want to clear the form inputs. How can we do that? That's also something we can do with JavaScript. We can take that input description element, and previously we took the value with dot value to see what the user wrote. We can also set it to something. We can assign something to it. We can just assign an empty string to it. Same with the input amount element. We can say its value should just be an empty string. Right, so now if I refresh, let's say garage sale 500. I submit the form, it gets added, and the form nicely cleans up. So now we can immediately continue with the next one. Right, if you have a lot of transactions to input here, that would be nice. All right, now if I submit something here, for example, maybe book sale. Let's say I made $50. If I press enter now, the form also gets submitted, right? So not only when you click it, also when you press enter, that's nice. But this input is still focused, as you can see, right? I don't want to, after submitting this input should not be focused. So we want to unfocus, or also called blur the form inputs. Right, so for both of them, again, we can also do that with JavaScript. So we can take that input description element and we can call blur on that, dot blur. We can also take the input amount and call blur on that. Right, so you can see pretty much anything you can think of that you want to do with JavaScript, we can do. Right, so now if I write garage sale 500, if I press enter here, it gets submitted, and indeed this is not focused anymore. Alright, now of course when we add this transaction item of garage sale plus 500, of course the income number here should also increase, and then of course also the balance. Let's first work on the income and expenses numbers, and this is actually very similar to what we did before. Now let's see. This is all for the form, and here in the other click handler function, here we were also updating the income or expenses. And there is one thing we forgot to do here. Here when we take the current income, right? So here we were taking this current number from the HTML. That's what we do here. We get a string here. It's better to convert this to a number type. It actually didn't give us a problem, but it could cause problems in slightly different scenarios. So let's quickly add the plus sign here, and also for this one, right? So for the expenses, just to convert it to a number, be a little bit more precise, and it will avoid certain issues. Okay, so this is basically the code that we now also want to run. So we can actually just copy this entire if-else statement. And here, now when we submit the form, here we now want to update income or expenses, right? If we are submitting an expense. So here we can now paste that if-else statement. So here, let's see, here we still get the amount, right? So we are getting the amount that the user input here, right? That's what we store in amount here. But then here later we can still use that variable, right? So if it's a positive number, we can take the current income. That's what we do here. I take the current income, calculate the updated income, and that's actually a plus. It should be, and this time it should be a plus, right? So here we take the current income plus whatever the user added here, right? So this would be 500. So this should be a plus here. Right? Because before we were removing the transactions, now we're adding a transaction. So here it should be plus. And then we want to assign the updated income to this number, right? Let's see, with the expenses, if we add an expense here, we're going to get the current number, 300. And now let's see, current expenses, well, if we add an expense, let's say $100 expense, this actually should increase. The total for expenses should increase, not minus. So we should change the minus into a plus here as well. Right, now if this is a negative number, if this is negative 100, and we would leave this off, we would get something like this. Right, so a plus and a minus. Now if you have a plus and a minus in math, that's a minus. So better to convert this to a positive number again. So negative 100 times negative 1 would be 100. Right, so then it would be 300 plus 100, so you get 400 in total. A little bit complicated here with the math. By the way, if you have a multiplication, it comes before addition. Right, so multiplication goes first and then you add something. Right, don't worry, programming these days is not, very math heavy. This is the basics, I guess. This is about as much as you're gonna need in terms of math. I think that's it. So let's try this out. If I refresh here, so garage sale. Let's say we made 500 for that. And now I'm gonna submit the form. And you can see this income number increased by 500 as well. Okay. So now we had accident. Let's say we had an accident cost us 100. So I use a negative 100 here. If I submit the form now, okay, so now this is what we get. So expenses is indeed 400, which is what it should be. So that's correct. So this updating here goes correct. But now we get an issue here with the li. And the reason is, of course, when we construct this HTML, here we're hard coding a plus sign always, right? So this amount is going to be negative 100. But here we still have a plus sign. We only want to add the plus sign if it's actually a positive number. Right? If amount is actually a positive number, then we want to add the plus sign. So let's write some logic here. So we can actually use this dollar sign and then the curly braces wherever we want. So also right before this one. And here we can just write some quick JavaScript logic. Right? We can actually use, this is a good use case for the ternary operator. So this is basically the if-else statement. Right? So if the amount is positive, it's nicer to use the ternary operator here. So we can say, is the amount more than 0, sorry, is it greater than 0, then we want to return a plus sign here. Otherwise, nothing, right? Just an empty string, right? Logic here becomes it looks a bit messy here, but here this is one expression here, JavaScript expression. We're gonna have just a quick check. Is the amount greater than 0? We will get a plus here, right? That's what we will get here. Otherwise, we get nothing. It will just be this, right? And if it's negative 100, it will just be negative 100 here, right? So this is what we have right now. Whoops. Right, so this is what we have. Okay, let's check it out. I'm going to refresh and try again with a new negative number. So here, that's an accident. And it cost us $100, so negative 100. And now, indeed, we see nice negative 100. Now, one other problem here, of course, is it shouldn't get a green border. It should get a red border, just like for the groceries. And that's because we are always giving this li that we're inserting this class of dash dash income. It should only be income if it's a positive number. Right, so here we can just write a quick JavaScript expression again. We can say is amount greater than 0. Oops, greater than 0. If this is true, it should be income. Otherwise, it should be expense. Right, so this is one of the advantages of using these template literals, is you can very easily write some quick JavaScript expressions in here. Very helpful if you have to insert HTML like we're doing here. Okay, so let's check out if this works now. Let's see, accident, negative 100. And indeed, we get a red border now. And now if we make, if we add a positive transaction, let's say garage sale, I made 500 on this. Just enter here, and we still get a green border with a plus sign, right? So, but a bit tricky here. The details can be quite tricky, but that's the real world. And now we can continue here, right? So a lot of code again, and all of this code is still running whenever this event occurs, right? So all of this is still in one function, and this one function gets run whenever this event occurs. All of this is super quick. The computer is super quick, so it can run these statements very quickly. And browser can very easily update the page. So all of this will be done very quickly, but for us, it seems like a lot. Okay, so one of the last things we need to do here, let's see. One of the last things we need to do here, of course, is also update this balance number. So if I refresh here, garage sale. Right, so if this is 500, and I should also be able to just write plus 500, by the way. So let's actually quickly check this. This also works as it should, right? So that doesn't cause any issues. Right, book sale. So now, of course, if I add something like this, the balance number should also be updated, right? So after every submission of the form, at the end, we should also update the balance number. So we can just say update balance. Right, the balance is just the income minus the expenses. Right, so we can say const income is we can just take the number from the HTML here, right? So the latest number. So we can just say number income element. We already were using that. We can just take its text content, right? Now this will give us a string type. So a bit safer to make that a number type by using the unary operator. And then we also want to get the current expenses. So we can use number expenses element dot text content. also will give us a string. So I'm going to reuse the unary operator here. And then we can calculate the updated balance. So updated balance number, or just updated balance, is income minus expenses, right? And of course, then we need to actually set that here in the HTML. So we have a reference to that already, balance number element. We can set its text content to be whatever the updated balance is, right? Take the current income, take the current expenses, calculate what the updated balance should be, and then actually reflect that here in the HTML, right? So now if I refresh, garage sale, if I make this 500, let's see if this balance number also changes. Yes, it does change. And is it correct? 5,500 minus 300. Yes, that's actually correct. Right? If we add a negative number here, let's say accident, cost us 100 as an expense. And now also you can see it decreased, right? Test, another one. Let's make it a big one. Negative 5,000. It becomes 100, right? Now if let's actually try removing these as well. So if I remove this test one, it should, well, the expenses should go down by 5,000. The balance should go up by 5,000. And that's correct, right? Accident. You can see all of this is working now, right? And now it should be 0, right? So all of this is working now. Now, one thing we may also want to do is after we update the balance here, we may also want to check if it's a negative number, because maybe we have some major accident and it cost us, let's say, 7,000. Right now it's a negative number. It would be nice to sort of see that in red. And we actually already did that before. So here if we go to the other one, make red if balance is negative, we can just copy this. And here after updating the balance, we can paste this. If we can still use the same variable names because we also have that here. By the way, we can use the same variable names. We have income and expenses here. We also have that here in the other click handler. Let's see, yeah, click handler, that's fine because these variables are scoped to this block, right? So wherever you see the curly braces, these variables with const and let are scoped to that. So if you have another block, you can use the same names for variables. It will not clash, right? So this is just a separate variable. It happens to have the same name, but these are two different ones, right? So here, what we're doing, if it's less than 0, we're gonna take that balance number element. We're gonna use the quick and dirty way with style and just set its color to red. Right, so if I save that and refresh, we had a major accident, let's say, cost us 8,000. I'm gonna submit the form and we get a red number here. All right, well done for making it this far. We're pretty much finished. So very quickly, this is a big function. And we're all writing this now when we add the event listener, all in these parentheses of this add event listener. Now, typically people do write, especially for bigger functions like this, their own, as an independent function. So we could create a function here, which we could call submit handler, right? Or handle submit. Right, let's call it submit handler. And let's move all of these statements in there. So I'm going to move all of these statements. I'm going to select all of them. And then I'm going to hold Alt up arrow key to move them up. Right, or just you can do it manually as well. See, it's a bit tricky. So I'm putting all of this in here. Now remember, we will get an object representing the event object, typically actually called event. It's going to be assigned to whatever we put here. We can call it EV, but then we have to use EV in here, right? Typically called event. Let's see. So then here we can remove this and we can just reference this submit handler function. Don't call it, right? We don't want to run all of those statements at the point of adding the event listener. Only when the event actually occurs, when the form actually gets submitted, do we want to run a function called submit handler, meaning run the statements in the function body. Right, so this I think looks a bit cleaner. You can separate these add event listeners from the actual logic that you want to run. Now this is a traditional function. This is a function declaration as it's called. If we want to convert this to an arrow function, we can say const submit handler is event, and then you get the fat arrow. Right, so all of this is the parameter. So this is the function. It's an anonymous function because it has no name. Right? So this is a function and we're assigning that to submit handler, and therefore we can still use the submit handler name to call the function to reference it. Now it has one input here, one parameter, so you can also leave off the parentheses. Right, so this is the modern arrow function syntax, but you also still see that function declaration syntax quite often. All right, so this was a lot to take in, completely normal if you're confused by some concepts. As a beginner, some of these things are going to look a bit strange or scary, and it's just going to take a little bit of repetition to get used to them. So if you really want to become a professional JavaScript developer, I highly recommend you check out my professional JavaScript course, in which we will actually start from beginner level all the way to advanced level, and you walk away with mastery of modern JavaScript. So I highly recommend you check that out. The link is in the description. Same goes for CSS, by the way. It's really important as a front-end developer that you understand concepts like Flexbox and CSS grid and animations and transitions. So I have a course on CSS as well. Definitely check it out. The link's in the description.
By the way, if this was helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Also, check out my courses on CSS and JavaScript if you want to take those skills to an advanced level. Because in there, we will build some beautiful real-world projects from scratch so you can see how everything fits together and really master CSS or JavaScript. And I will also release other courses soon like React and Node.js. So if you want to be notified, then make sure you are subscribed to the email newsletter. You can find the link in the description. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.